Chapter 11-12. When Ning-Ke and Sang-Sang were besieged by the cultivation world, they went to the West Wilderness through the Buddha's chessboard. The Lank Temple in the autumn rain suffered the wrath of the academy. Jun Mo's iron sword pierced through the air and cut the largest Buddha statue on the top of the tile mountain into countless pieces. The pieces rolled down from the peak and piled up in the valley, crushing half of the old temple. Fortunately, the huge rocks did not cause a disaster to the town. They had been soaked by the sea rain and wind for years and were gradually covered with moss. Instead, they had become a rare scenery. When the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival stopped and the incense in the Lank Temple declined, it had become the only way to attract tourists. The main income of the town's residents now came from the stones that the Buddha statues had turned into. The people broke these boulders into countless small pieces, then carved them into Buddha statues and sold them to the tourists who admired them. Of course, it was very difficult to break the boulders. Even the heaviest hammer and the sharpest iron knife could not help the residents achieve their goal easily. The most common method for people was to burn them with fire and pour them with water. The fire was a wildfire ignited by the hay in the fields outside the town. The water was the seawater from the tile mountain. The quarry in the southeast of the town was filled with smoke from morning to night. The hot steam rose and the slightly red rocks suddenly made a sizzling sound when they encountered the cold seawater. This repeated tastelessly again and again. Eventually, there would be a clear crack on the hard rocks, and that was the key to breaking the rocks. Ning-Ke stood on the hillside beside the quarry and watched the process of the residents breaking the stones. He watched in silence for a long time, watching the alternation of fire and water, and the cracks that appeared on the moss-covered boulders. He found that most of the cracks followed a certain pattern when they appeared, and two oblique cracks would meet at a certain place. The two cracks formed together and looked like a word. He naturally remembered the sword marks on the rocks at the bottom of the Daming Lake in the depths of the Tianqi Mountain many years ago. Youngest uncle had used a sword to write countless words outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, thus making the great blockage formation left by the great divine priest of light, the founder of the Devil's Doctrine, useless. The rock was broken into smaller pieces, which were then smashed by the adults with iron. Then, the children rushed over and picked up the stones of different sizes that they could carry. Then, they carefully selected the stones and separated them according to their size and the direction of the stone lines. Finally, they were delivered to the hands of the stonemasons. Of course, most of the stonemasons in the town became a monk halfway through their cultivation. Ning-Ke, for example, only began to learn Buddhism halfway through his cultivation. However, they carved day and night and became very skilled at it. A square stone about a foot long could be turned into a beautifully carved Buddha statue in 10 days and nights. After Ning-Ke finished looking at the broken rocks, he watched the stonemasons carve Buddha. After watching for 3 days, he began to learn Buddha carving from the stonemasons. It did not take long for him to become the best carver in Wa Mountain. In the last few years of the Buddha's chessboard, he had made the entire mountain look like a Buddha. How difficult could the stones be for him? However, the Buddha statue he carved was very different from the one made by the stonemasons in the town. The stonemasons praised his comprehension and skills and raised many opinions, but he only smiled and did not explain. The Buddha statue that Ning-Ke carved did not have a wide forehead and big ears, let alone a compassionate one. Instead, it was a slightly plump young woman with her hair combed into a bun. It was obvious that the young woman's expression was extremely cold. One day, it was raining in the Lank Temple. Ning-Ke was holding a stone outside the temple and continuing to carve. Suddenly, a lazy voice came from behind. Did she successfully lose weight? She lost some weight in Chaoyang City in the chessboard. Ning-Ke placed the stone statue in a dozen stone statues beside him. He put down his carving knife, patted the dust off his body and stood up. The man said, "She lost so little weight in 1,000 years? It seems that Haotian is not omnipotent." Ning Ke smiled and turned around to hug him. He said, "Didn't you like her before? Why are you so mean now? It doesn't suit your high and mighty identity as the leader of the new stream." Chen Pipi curled his lips in boredom and said, "Do you like her high and mighty, or do you like her as before?" Ning Ke thought about it and found that the answer was indeed obvious. He smiled helplessly and looked at Tang Xiaotang, who was standing beside him. He was surprised to find that she still had a ponytail and said, "Not married yet?" Tang Xiaotang was not shy and said, "Waiting for my brother to come." Chen Pipi sighed and said, "I don't expect to wait for my father's approval." Ning Ke looked at him again and looked at the loose indigo robe he was wearing. He thought of the Abbey Dean who wore indigo robes twice in Chang'an and found that he did look like the Abbey Dean after losing weight. The three of them walked to the pavilion nearby. The autumn rain fell on the eaves of the pavilion and accumulated for a long time before turning into a thin stream, flowing down the pillars and wetting the ground under the pavilion. Chen Pipi asked, "Have you finished?" Ning Ke took out a scroll from his arms and handed it to him. He said, "It would be better if Yi Su or eldest brother wrote it. You know, I am a non-believer after all." It was something he wrote when he was meditating and observing the stones in the Lank Temple. If it was approved, it might become the last and most important volume of the doctrine of the new stream. Chen Pipi took the scroll and said, "Eldest brother will have a higher chance of success. It will be harder for me to do it. But don't worry, your efforts will not be wasted in my hands." Ning Ke said, "We don't have much time. We have to hurry." Chen Pipi opened the scroll and looked at the words about the new world, the divine kingdom and the afterlife. He frowned and said, "What a magnificent picture." Ning Ke said, "From the master to the uncle to our generation, the academy has spent 1,000 years to prepare. It would not be fun if we can't have a magnificent picture." Chen Pipi put away the file and looked at the weariness and haggard expression on his face. He thought about what he had done in the past 6 months. He took out a small porcelain bottle from his sleeve and handed it over, saying, "Take it when you need it." Ning Ke's expression changed slightly when he smelled the fragrance of the medicine in the porcelain bottle. He had taken this medicine before and knew how precious it was. He said, "At our current state, a heavenly power pill can only give us a chance. There is no need to waste it. I kept this medicine for senior brother Yi Su to help him break through the 5 states." Chen Pipi was silent for a moment and said, "But I didn't expect that he could no longer cultivate. Now that he is dead, what's the use of keeping it? Even if it can't help you break through the state, it can at least help you heal the hidden injuries in your body. It sounds cool to kill people from thousands of miles away, but it is extremely hard. You seem to be resting in the Lank Temple these days, but you are actually exhausting your energy. Both the academy and the new stream need you to keep standing." Ning Ke thought about it and didn't say anything else. He put the porcelain bottle into his sleeve. Tang Xiaotang said, "If youngest uncle thinks that the gift is too expensive and can't repay it, you can return it." Ning Ke smiled and said, "You are not married to him yet and you are already working for him? Tell me, what do you want?" Tang Xiaotang pointed at the row of stone statues outside the pavilion and said, "Give me one." Ning Ke didn't expect this. He walked out of the pavilion and picked up a stone statue that he was most satisfied with. He handed it to her and said, "It's not like I haven't seen the real person. Why do you need to look at this cold statue?" Tang Xiaotang took the stone statue and wiped the rain off with her sleeve. She put it away carefully and said, "If you can find her, why do you need to carve these cold statues?" Ning Ke was a little embarrassed and said, "I'm mainly learning how to break stones." Tang Xiaotang patted her chest and said, "If you want to learn, I can teach you." Many years ago, on the streets of Chang'an, there was a little girl whose chest could break stones. After so many years, she was still as heroic as ever. Ning Ke recalled the scene and felt a little emotional. As a youngest uncle, it was not convenient for him to see where her hands were. But Chun Pippi didn't have such a taboo. He murmured inside, "It's not big." Outside the Lank Temple, thousands of followers of the new stream were waiting for Chun Pippi and Tang Xiaotang. They were going to the Song Kingdom. Just like Ning Kai killing people from thousands of miles away, they were preaching from thousands of miles away. The scroll had been entrusted to them. Ning Kai didn't want to waste their time and sent them out of the temple. After Chun Pippi and Tang Xiaotang left, he continued to carve Buddha statues. Well, statues of Sang Sang. He made hundreds of statues of Sang Sang and lined them up in front of the hall. The statues of Sang Sang were either deep in thought, looking up at the sky, or looking at the world with their hands behind their back. There was only one thing in common: they were expressionless. The autumn rain fell from time to time, and the statues of Sang Sang were wet from time to time. He squinted and stared, holding his waist and arms, admiring the changes of the stone statues in the autumn rain. The situation of the world continued to change as time went by. The flames of war were everywhere, and the killing intent was everywhere. The war between the Tang Empire and Taoism had both wins and losses. The strategy of the West Hill Divine Palace played a certain role. The most important thing was that the Tang Empire, or the Academy, still couldn't find a way to cross that small town. In fact, Ning Kai didn't care much about that small town. Not many people could guess his thoughts. Long Qing was one of them. He stood in the bleak autumn wind at the top of Qingjing city of the Yan Kingdom, quietly waiting for Ning Kai's arrival. Many people had always thought that the battle between Ning Kai and Long Qing was inevitable and would happen at any time. However, unexpectedly, Ning Kai didn't come, and the battle never happened. Ning Kai looked at Sang Sang in the Lank Temple in the autumn rain. What was Sang Sang looking at now? The night in the cold region of the far north was long and cold. The hot sea had long been covered with thick snow. The light in the yurts left by the desolate man's tribe seemed to be frozen to pieces. Sang Sang sat by the light and looked at her fingertips. There was a bubble on her fingertip. The surface of the bubble was smooth, and it looked crystal and transparent under the light. The shape was extremely perfect. The indigo lion lay at her feet and looked at the bubble. Its eyes were full of curiosity, but it was instinctively afraid. It always felt that if it broke the bubble with its claws, the world would be destroyed. Ning Kai looked at the two cracks on the surface of the rock in the Lank Temple. There seemed to be two tiny cracks on the surface of the bubble between Sang Sang's fingers, and it would burst in the next moment. Like the hundreds of stone statues in the Lank Temple, her face was still expressionless. But it didn't mean indifference. It was more like calmness. She gently stroked her bulging belly. There was a delicious smell of soup coming from the corner of the yurt. In the morning, the indigo lion hunted a snow chicken. She was making chicken soup. I suddenly don't want to use my chest to break the big stone, or I may continue to use it in the next chapter. Well, it was hard today. Fortunately, I can sit up in the end. Chapter 11-13. Firstly, I want to thank those students. Secondly, regarding the heavenly power pill, I really forgot about it. Yesterday, when I was writing it, I tried to recall it seriously, only to realize that memory is really the most unreliable thing. Thank you to the students who pointed it out. I deeply apologize and will make changes. Lastly, wanting to write a different and awesome plot is really a painful thing, especially when one's ability isn't particularly strong. We will succeed. Thank you. Chapter 11-14. The bubble on Sang Sang's fingertip was perfect, but it was not a perfect circle. It had curves and an indescribable sense of beauty, just like her bulging belly. It seemed fragile, but it was incomparably firm. It was space itself. She was expressionless, but she was not indifferent, just calm. It seemed that the two cracks on the bubble and the bulging belly indicated something or the future, which was constantly changing her. A Taoist dressed in green suddenly appeared at the edge of the forest beside the cold snow sea. He changed the direction of the wind and the temperature of the field. He was the strongest person in the world now, possessing the wisest and far-sighted vision. However, the strange thing was that he turned a blind eye to the faint light in the yurt. He didn't turn a blind eye to it, but he really didn't see it. He didn't see the oil lamp, didn't see the steam rising from the pot of snow chicken soup, and didn't see Sang Sang by the window because Sang Sang didn't want him to see her. With a thought, he isolated the wooden yurt by the sea from the real world. That was the world of Haotian, and even he could not see it. Chen Mao stood quietly at the edge of the frozen forest, looking at the snow dancing wildly on the surface of the hot sea like smoke and dust, looking at the footprints of the beasts that were gradually covered by the wind and snow. Although he did not see what he wanted to see, he did not leave, because he had an intuition that the person he had been searching for should be here. Sang Sang sat quietly by the window. The dim light of the oil lamp shone on her chubby cheeks, and her hand fell on her bulging belly, motionless. She did not look at him by the forest, nor did she do anything, not even think. This was the 7th time the Mao had come to the cold snow sea to find her. Every time he came, he would get closer to her. He did not know whether he would see her face and approach her world the next time he came. The late autumn night in the north was extremely long, as if it would never stop. Only at certain moments would the sun show its face. The Mao stood by the forest for a whole night. His eyes were dazzled by the red sunlight, and he once again looked at the wooden yurts around the snow sea. After confirming that there was no trace of her, he disappeared again. In the corner of the yurt, the indigo lion lying by the stove was motionless. It was instinctively afraid of the human being, especially after seeing its owner silenced several times. It realized how terrifying the human being was. For the whole night, it didn't even dare to breathe, let alone wagging its tail to beg its owner to give it a drumstick. The indigo lion heaved a sigh of relief when the man finally left. It stood up on all fours and shook its head to make its slightly numb body more active. When it was about to show off to Sang Sang, it found that Sang Sang was still in the same position as last night, sitting quietly by the window without thinking, as if she didn't know that it had left. Soon after the sun rose, it fell into the dark ocean again. Sang Sang looked at the cold world outside the window. When the oil lamp burned out, the figure in green clothes appeared again in the woods. Sang Sang was still sitting quietly. Chen Mao left again. She sat there quietly, not sleeping, not eating, not talking, not thinking, not moving. A cold wind that didn't belong to nature blew, and the aura of heaven and earth changed slightly. A scholar in a cotton-padded jacket appeared in the woods. He looked around, as if he was looking for something. He was covered with dust, haggard, and extremely thin. He hadn't rested for a long time, and the cold wind could knock him down at any time. Sang Sang finally moved. She turned her head and shifted her gaze from the snow-covered sea to the woodland. Her eyes fell on the scholar, and a complicated emotion appeared in her indifferent eyes. She suddenly wanted to walk out of the yurt and go back to her own world. Because she felt that the scholar was trustworthy, but also a little scared and disgusted. So she didn't do anything in the end. The drunkard finally arrived the second day after the eldest brother left. He was the most powerful man who had experienced the everlasting night. The flagon on his waist swayed in the wind and snow, as if the wine in it had been drunk. Sang Sang didn't even look at him, nor was she as silent and cautious as the Chen Mao when he appeared. Finally, they all left. Sang Sang stood up by the window and walked to the stove. She looked at the pot of chicken soup that had long been boiled dry, and smelled the pungent burnt smell. She was silent for a long time. He didn't go home that night, so that she could finish the chicken soup in case it went bad. Did he finish the chicken soup in the end? Sang Sang thought of the note, and her right hand gently stroked her bulging belly. She suddenly felt very lonely and wanted someone to accompany her. All this happened when she thought of that person. This was her world. In this world, time was still passing, the chicken soup would be boiled dry, and the life in her belly would keep growing. She was getting weaker and weaker. If she couldn't maintain this world, it would be the moment of danger. She put the pot of burnt chicken in front of the indigo lion, and ignored its pitiful look. She took out an abacus from under the table and began to calculate the possible dangers and solutions. She had to provide endless nutrients for the little life in her belly, and at the same time, she had to be isolated from the human world. She didn't have enough energy to calculate like before. Her chess skills were still unbeatable, and she was still unbeatable at the poker table. Neither Chen Pipi nor Song Qian and other human geniuses were her opponents. But she couldn't calculate everything in the world. She had to rely on humans' calculation tools to reason and calculate those important things. She was the rule of this world. However, after she came to the human world, she was contaminated by the mortal world, and her speed was not as fast as those three human beings. This was a very dangerous thing. If she had to escape, how could she be faster? Clap, 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 clap. The crisp sound of plates hitting against each other came from the dark yurt. It sounded like a cheerful song. The indigo lion was gnawing on the burnt chicken bones, happily wagging its tail. Song Song's right hand moved quickly on the abacus, leaving a series of residual shadows. She looked calm and focused. The perfect bubble appeared in her left hand again. On the smooth surface of the bubble, more than 10 light spots appeared. If compared with the map of the human world, those light spots were Helan City, Chang'an, the West Hill, the Kingdom of Song, the Lank Temple, the depths of the West Wilderness, the beginning or the end of those space passages. The last autumn rain fell, and the central plains were extremely cold. The war in the human world had finally reached the last step. The Tang Empire reorganized its navy, and tens of thousands of ships raced to the South Jin Kingdom. The South Jin Kingdom, which had been frightened by Ning Kei's killing of their emperor and ministers, had no power to resist. Coupled with the reputation of the sword Garrett, the gate of Linkong was opened within 10 days. The army of the Great River Kingdom also crossed the surging Yellow River and headed north. The Divine Chariot and the Royal Chariot led tens of thousands of people of the Great River Kingdom. They did something that no one had dared to think of for generations. They marched towards the West Hill Divine Kingdom. The Tang army had entered the border of the West Hill Divine Kingdom and was less than 200 miles away from Peach Mountain. The sacred sedan of judgment had arrived at the Muyu town in the south and was only 300 miles away from Peach Mountain. The West Hill Divine Kingdom was besieged from both the north and the south. Although they had recalled all the powerhouses of Haotian Taoism and tens of thousands of cavalrymen of the Divine Halls had set up several lines of defense around Peach Mountain, everyone knew that the Divine Halls were in danger. On the balcony of the White Divine Palace on the peak of Peach Mountain, Xiong Chumo was looking at the human world shrouded by the autumn rain. His haggard face was filled with frustration. He did not know what else he could do. It seemed that it was the last moment for him to conclude his life, but he did not know how to conclude it. Where was the Abbey Dean? What was he doing? Why didn't Haotian respond to the prayers of the devout believers? Why was it that the blasphemers had won one victory after another, but the heavenly messenger had yet to arrive? What was going on? Was Haotian Taoism, which had ruled the world for countless years, going to be destroyed? Xiong Chumo was enraged out of desperation. The filthiest words and the most vicious curses burst out from his mouth and resounded through the entire Peach Mountain like thunder. Those words were meant for the Abbey Dean. However, even at this moment, he still did not dare to say the Abbey Dean's name, which made him look extremely pitiful. The mountain wind blew and dispersed the misty rain, revealing the small town at the foot of the mountain. In the autumn wind and rain, the town was still as tranquil as the sky, unaffected. Looking at the town, Xiong Chumo gradually calmed down. Even if the Abbey Dean was not coming back, as long as that person was there, the Tang and the Academy would not be able to get close to Peach Mountain. Then there was nothing to worry about. There were still many things to worry about. Xiong Chumo looked at the distant mountain in the autumn rain. He seemed to have seen Su Shi's flag and the fearsome armored cavalry of the Tang army. He felt the weight on his shoulders getting heavier. Long Qing still refuses to bring the rest of the people back. What is he doing? Is he really going to disobey the decree? And what is he doing in Yan Kingdom? Waiting to be killed by Ning Ke? Xiong Chumo roared angrily in a low voice. The middle-aged priest stood beside him and said calmly, "If he can really keep Ning Ke in Yan Kingdom, it will be a great achievement for the divine halls." Xiong Chumo sneered, "That depends on whether he has the ability or not." The middle-aged priest said calmly, "If he can't, then no one else can." Xiong Chumo slightly frowned and turned to him. He did not expect that the priest would have such a high opinion of Long Qing. He said carefully, "Hengmu was killed by Ning Quebec. Long Qing has not even passed the 5 states. How can he be a match for him? Years ago, I saw Long Qing climb up from the abyss. If Hengmu and Long Qing fought, Hengmu would be the one to die. As for Long Qing and Ning Ke, who is stronger and who will be the final winner, no one else has the right to judge. They can only fight for the last time." The middle-aged priest said calmly. He had always played the role of a bystander in Taoism. He knew more than most people, so he was calmer. Xiong Chumo paused for a while and said, "The enemy is coming. Taoism has to do something." The middle-aged priest looked at the small town in the autumn rain and said, "I will go and have a look." Chapter 11:15. There was only one butcher's shop in the town. There was only one butcher in the world. The middle-aged Taoist stood outside the door and looked at the butcher, who was covered in grease but no sweat. He said, "Since you are here, you have to do something." The butcher was dividing the pork. Hearing this, he kept silent for a long time and asked in a hoarse voice, "Is your senior brother really going to do that rebellious thing?" The middle-aged Taoist said calmly, "What do you mean by rebellious? First of all, we have to determine the concept of Taoism. You and the drunkard have been hiding under Haotian's eyes for tens of thousands of years. Isn't that against her Taoism?" The butcher's ink-like thick eyebrows slowly rose as he said, "How dare you?" The middle-aged Taoist said, "Helping my senior brother is also good for you." The butcher said, "To help your senior brother, I just need to stay in the town and not come here. Because you and I both know that helping your senior brother and helping Taoism are two different things." The middle-aged Taoist kept silent for a while and said, "The agreement between you and Haotian is still valid." The butcher remained silent for a long time. At first, it was because he needed time to think about what the Abbey Dean wanted him to do. Later, it was because someone had come. Hearing the footsteps, he asked, "What do you need me to do?" The middle-aged Taoist stood outside the door and did not look back at the approaching figure. He said, "The Tang army is armored and heavy cavalry. No one can stop them. I don't want the divine hall to be peaceful forever. I just want some pavilions and halls." The butcher put down his knife and said indifferently, "Is that all?" The middle-aged Taoist said, "If you can kill the people from the academy, it will be the best." The butcher and the drunkard were the two grand cultivators who had lived the longest in the world, even longer than the Buddha Yard and the headmaster of the academy. They had been living in seclusion until the headmaster ascended to heaven and Haotian came to the world. During these years, the drunkard had fought several times, which made the academy feel pressured. But the butcher had never done anything. Of course, he was strong, even the strongest in the world. He was different from the chief monk of scripture who had been buried with the Prajna peak. He was strong, but his blade was even stronger because he was good at killing. For countless years, he had killed pigs, sheep, cows, and people. His strength lay in killing. He had lived in seclusion for many years and had killed fewer people. It was not because of a change in his state of mind, but because of the headmaster's request. The butcher said with an indifferent expression, "They're just some pigs and sheep. There's no harm in killing them." As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of cicadas rang out in the small town. At this time, the autumn rain was chilly, and the sound of cicadas in the rain was even more mournful. Amidst the sound of cicadas, a little girl in a yellow dress slowly walked over from the other side of the town. She walked to the butcher's shop and looked inside. The rainwater at the end of her ponytail was like fine pearls. As she moved, it floated to the ground inside the threshold. Then, the tip of her nose wrinkled beautifully. It was very cute. She thought the smell of blood in the butcher's shop was too strong and unpleasant, just like the butcher's words. "Others are pigs and sheep, but you are a dog. I've never understood why people like you and the drunkard are willing to be dogs. Is this matter really that interesting?" Yu Lian's young face was full of inquiry. Because of her seriousness, she looked very cute. Her yellow dress was wet by the rain, but she did not look embarrassed. Instead, she was still cute. Her black ponytail was naturally the cutest. She was such a cute and scary little girl. She had recovered from the wounds she suffered in the battle with the national master of the Golden Tribe in the wilderness. She did not stop and traveled thousands of miles south to the West Hill Divine Kingdom. How could the tens of thousands of cavalrymen from the divine halls of West Hill stop her? It was not until she came to the door of the butcher's shop that the divine halls of West Hill noticed her arrival. The sharp warning sound cut through the rain, and the sound of hoofbeats could be heard. Countless people came to the small town, but did not dare to step on the long street. The butcher looked at the little girl outside the butcher's shop and guessed her identity. He said expressionlessly, "It's better to be a dog in peace than a person in chaos. This is what your teacher said to me in the town." Yu Lian's eyes fell on the knife in his hand. She said casually, "What he said might not be right." The butcher said, "I heard that you are this generation's leader of the Devil's Doctrine." The Devil's Doctrine emphasizes on absorbing the chi of heaven and earth into the body, which is similar to what I realized years ago. In this way, I should be your ancestor. But since you don't even care about what the headmaster of the academy said, I guess you don't care about this either. Yu Lian put her hands behind her back and stood on tiptoe to look into the butcher's shop. She looked like a cute little girl who was learning from adults. She said casually, "The Enlightenment doctrine has always been good at deceiving and destroying our ancestors." The butcher said indifferently, "You are an interesting kid. No one has dared to talk to me like this for many years. Maybe you can be proud of it." He had lived in the world for countless years. In terms of age, he could call everyone a kid. Yu Lian was not annoyed. She looked at him and said, "I also think you are interesting." The butcher asked, "Where?" Yu Lian said slowly, "No one has ever dared to talk to me like this except for my teacher. I think he was the one who talked to you like this many years ago. It seems that he is more powerful." The butcher was silent for a moment and suddenly threw the knife in his hand. The butcher's knife, which was covered in blood and oil, fell heavily on the ground outside the sill with a loud bang. Smoke and dust rose, and gravel shot into the dense autumn rain. It was as if a mountain had fallen from the sky to the mortal world. "If you can hold this knife, we will talk about other things," he said. Yu Lian squatted down with her hands behind her back and looked at the legendary knife for a while. Then she carefully rolled up her sleeves and took out a handkerchief. She pinched the back of the knife with only 2 fingers through the handkerchief. She used 2 fingers to slowly lift the heaviest knife in the world off the ground. As she moved, the weight of the iron knife passed to her feet. With 2 crisp sounds, 2 cobweb-like cracks appeared on the bluestone floor outside the door sill of the butcher's shop. Throughout this process, her brows were furrowed and her expression was solemn. Then she put down the iron knife. "Very good. You are qualified to talk to me." The butcher looked at her coldly and said, "Although it was a bit hard, you lifted it after all." Yu Lian shook her head and carefully wiped her fingers with the handkerchief. She said, "You old people always like to talk to yourselves. I just think it is too dirty. Do you think it is really heavy?" She frowned and concentrated because she did not want her fingers to be stained with blood or oil. The butcher was silent for a long time and said, "You are indeed very strong. Thank you for your recognition, Senior." Yu Lian said casually. She was not serious at all. Her strength did not need anyone's approval, even if that person was the legendary butcher. "If you were given the same time as me, no, even half or even 1/10 of my time, you might be able to defeat me and even obtain the real immortality." The butcher looked at her and said, "Unfortunately, you will not have that time anymore. So you are not strong enough. No matter who comes from the academy, it is not enough because you are not strong enough." Yu Lian said, "You have not been in the world for many years. You do not know that the strongest thing in the academy is the word strong." The butcher said, "Do you want to talk about Ning Ke who inherited Kuharan's legacy? He is indeed good. Unfortunately, 1,000 miles of wind blew in Yangzhou City. Now he is, lacking breath." As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his eyebrows again. Footsteps were heard in the autumn rain again. The footsteps were very steady. A powerhouse like the butcher could naturally hear that there was something wrong with the center of gravity of the person's body. However, it was still so steady, which meant that it was terrifying. The person was wearing a shabby monk's robe. His short hair was like angry pine, but his expression was very calm. He walked in the rain, and the distance between each step seemed to be measured with a ruler in advance. There was no deviation. Jun Mo had always been a person who would never make a mistake. The butcher looked at him with a serious expression and said, "Or, would you like to try and see if you can pick up my knife?" Jun Mo took the handkerchief from Yu Lian's hand and carefully wiped the rain off his face. He glanced at the knife on the ground and did not understand what the butcher was talking about. He looked at the butcher as if he was looking at an idiot. Yu Lian looked at the butcher as if she was looking at an ignorant child. She said, "I said that you don't care about the world, and you really don't. You have no idea that the strongest person in the academy has never been Ning Quebec. Indeed, the strongest people in the academy had always been Jun Mo and Yu Lian. The butcher was perhaps the strongest person in the cultivation world or even in the entire history of cultivation. The strongest here did not refer to the state of cultivation, but specifically referred to the strength and strength. Therefore, the 2 strongest people in the academy came to meet him. The butcher was naturally not in a good mood to be looked at and ignored by 2 juniors of the academy. His face became a little gloomy, but he did not say anything. Yu Lian asked, "Is it enough now?" The butcher said, "It is enough. You can try to fight with me together." Yu Lian said, "The headmaster said that words must be justified, and it is very important. Jun Mo likes to use peaceful means before resorting to force. Therefore, since it is enough, maybe we can talk about something first." The butcher took a deep breath. He had been prepared for a real battle for countless years, but he was rebuffed by Yu Lian's words. His depressed mood turned into one word, "Speak." Yu Lian said, "It seems to be a little inconvenient today." The butcher squinted his eyes and slightly raised his eyebrows. He stared at her without saying a word. Yu Lian said, "I am not afraid of you. What's the use of staring at me?" Then she turned around and looked at the middle-aged Taoist. She said, "Do you know why it is inconvenient?" The middle-aged Taoist sighed and said, "I guess it is because I am here. But powerful people, why do you care about me?" Yu Lian said, Of course it is because you are very strong. The middle-aged Taoist smiled and said, I have done nothing since the beginning. Yu Lian said calmly, that is why it is so great. Until now, I do not even know your name. I have to say that it is very admirable. To the human world, she was a great fog. However, this seemingly calm and harmless middle-aged Taoist had silently guarded the Jishou Abbey for decades. Even she could not see through him. His true face seemed to be hidden in the fog, so it was naturally worth being vigilant. I have been feeling unwell these few days, and even have mental problems. I have been adjusting, and it is all right. Let's put our palms together, hug, and pat each other on the back. Everyone is strong. Chapter 11:16. The middle-aged Taoist did not smile or speak. He just stood aside quietly, as if Yu Lian's attention and Jun Mo's silence meant nothing to him. At this moment, the rain became lighter, and the sound of hooves and wheels rolling over stones came from the street again. The roasted sweet potato shop at the other end of the town was closed. The white-haired old man and the middle-aged man, father and son, sat in an ox cart in the drizzle. They stopped in front of the butcher shop for a while, and the son came out with 2 hot roasted sweet potatoes. Yu Lian and Jun Mo took the roasted sweet potatoes and nodded. The old man wiped the raindrops from his white hair and patted the ox's thick neck. He said, it will be difficult to eat in the town from now on. His family had been roasting sweet potatoes in the town in front of Peach Mountain for thousands of years. It had been passed down from ancestors to the present generation. In addition to keeping an eye on the Divine Hall for the academy, the most important reason was that the headmaster of the academy liked to eat the roasted sweet potatoes from his family in the original town. The battle was about to begin. The father and son left the town. Those cavalrymen of Divine Hall who were hiding in the rain and outside the town did not dare to stop them. They silently made way for them. Yu Lian tore open the slightly charred skin of the roasted sweet potato and used her little finger to pick out some red sweet potato flesh and put it into her mouth. She pursed her delicate lips and chewed for a while. She felt that although it was delicious, it was not as exaggerated as what her teacher had said. Jun Mo thought for a while and did not eat it on the spot. He wrapped the roasted sweet potato with a handkerchief and put it in his arms. Then he looked at the middle-aged Taoist. His eyes pierced through the autumn rain and fell somewhere. Yu Lian reminded him, that handkerchief is mine. Jun Mo said, that's my senior brother's. Yu Lian was a little annoyed and ignored him. She held the roasted sweet potato and looked at the butcher inside the gate. She said, the Abbey Dean does not care about the survival of Taoism. You have no reason to care. She talked about the sweet potato and the handkerchief a moment ago, and then she talked about Taoism and the human world the next moment. Life and holiness were never easy to be unified and harmonious, so her words and deeds were a little cute. It was raining in the town today. She seemed to deliberately make herself go the way of cuteness. The butcher slightly raised his eyebrows and said, how can a junior like you understand? Yu Lian looked around and found there was no trash can on the street. She threw the roasted sweet potato that she did not want to eat on the ground and said, isn't it just betting on both sides? Butcher's ink-black eyebrows rose higher and higher. Yu Lian said, the drunkard went with the Abbey Dean. Whether he was helping or spying on the Abbey Dean, even if he was betting on the Abbey Dean, you came to the Peach Mountain to bet on the Taoism that was abandoned by the Abbey Dean. What I don't understand is why none of you are willing to bet on the academy. The butcher mocked, because there is no Haotian in the academy. Yu Lian looked at him expressionlessly for a long time before saying, does Taoism have it? Don't forget to bet on both sides. It's easy to miss out on both. The butcher was silent for a moment, then said, if I kill you, I can stand on the riverbank and wait for the result to appear. No matter who wins, it won't do me any harm. Yu Lian asked, "Do you really want to see the end?" The butcher said, "Yes." Yu Lian said with a resentful expression, "It's really rotten. Apart from watching, apart from waiting like a dog, I don't dare to do anything else interesting." The butcher walked to the threshold of the butcher's shop and picked up the knife on the ground. Looking at the gray sky that was cut into countless thin strips by the autumn rain, he said, "When you live long enough, you will be as careful as us." Jun Mo didn't say much. Hearing the butcher's sigh, he said, "The longer you live so carefully, the more boring it will be." After saying this, he walked out of the town with Yu Lian. The autumn rain fell on the apprentice brother and sister, making them slightly wet. The rainwater on the street splashed with their footsteps. Standing at the entrance of the town in the autumn rain, Jun Mo said, "I didn't see it." Yu Lian frowned and said, "According to Yi Hongyu's memory, there should be some remnants of the arcane scroll of the fall. If it's not in the hands of that Taoist, where is it now?" At this moment, the middle-aged Taoist said from afar, "You two have come from afar. Why don't you go up the mountain and be our guests?" Yu Lian turned around and said to him, "Evil guests don't need to be invited. Let's skip it today." The middle-aged Taoist said, "Both of you, please enlighten me." Yu Lian said, "I am the Grandmaster of the Devil's Doctrine who has entered the West Hill and is the closest to the Peach Mountain in the past 1,000 years. I am satisfied with this. If the butcher doesn't do it, why should I?" Jun Mo was more direct than her. He looked at the middle-aged Taoist and said, "I dare not enlighten you. I just want to send a message to the people of the Divine Hall. From today on, no one can leave the Peach Mountain." The middle-aged Taoist's expression changed slightly. At this moment, a thunder suddenly sounded in the rain clouds in the sky. More than 1,000 cavalrymen of the Divine Hall of West Hill, as well as the priests and deacons hiding in the woods, heard Jun Mo's words and the thunder, and were stunned and did not know what to say. It was a plain and casual sentence, but it was extremely domineering. As if to prove Jun Mo's words, the sound of horses' hooves could be faintly heard from the depths of the autumn rain. The earth trembled slightly, and the rainwater in the puddles trembled a little. It was obviously still far away, but because of the fierce momentum, it gave people a feeling that even the autumn rain was about to be blown away by the wind and thunder. In the north, Su Shi personally led the cavalry of the Tang Empire. They broke through the 3 lines of defense of the Divine Hall of West Hill in the morning and arrived at the bridgeside town, which was more than 40 miles away from the Peach Mountain. In the east, Monk Guan Hai led hundreds of monk soldiers from the Lank Temple and marched silently in the autumn rain. As for the powerhouses of the Buddhism sect, including the chess masters, they should arrive sooner. In the west, the silver-haired Cheng Lixue was gathering the old subordinates of the Divine Hall of Revelation in the Snow Tree Village. They were almost there. He looked at the Divine Hall of Revelation on the Peach Mountain, where he grew up, and sighed silently. In the south, countless Xiao swords flashed. In the gloomy valley, countless trees that were wet by the rain were cut by the swords. The blood-red sacred sedan and the pear-blossom white royal sedan, under the protection of tens of thousands of soldiers from the Great River Army, slowly approached the Peach Mountain. The deacons of the Divine Hall of West Hill they met along the way did not even dare to speak. The Peach Mountain was surrounded, and the Divine Hall of West Hill was in danger. Jun Mo said that from this moment on, people could only enter the Peach Mountain, but not leave. It was not that he was domineering, but that the Academy had the right to say this. What was shocking and puzzling was that the Academy did not immediately attack the Peach Mountain. Perhaps it had something to do with the butcher in the small town, or maybe it was because of some other reason. The Academy seemed to be waiting for something. At the same time, many people noticed that at such an important, or even final moment, Ning Ke and Long Qing were not there. One day before, Ning Ke finished his cultivation process of watching the stones crack in the Lank Temple. He looked at the hundreds of statues of Sang Sang in the rain in front of the temple and smiled with satisfaction. He picked out a statue that he was most satisfied with and put it in his arms. It was a statue of Sang Sang sleeping on her side. She was sleeping on the hot and hard Kong, but she was still curled up and wanted to crawl into someone's arms. Her feet were exposed outside the quilt, and they were as white as two snow-white lotus flowers. They were so tender that people would feel pity for them. He left the tile mountain in the autumn rain and once again embarked on his journey to find Sang Sang. But this time, he was much more confident. It seemed that he had a premonition, so he went straight to the north. Before the tile mountain was the kingdom of Song. There was a small town at the border between the kingdom of Song and the kingdom of Yen. On the day he walked into the town, it suddenly snowed. He heard that it was the first snow of the year. The only butcher's shop in the town was closed, but the calligraphy and painting shop was still open. The drunkard who liked to drink was nowhere to be found, so there was only the fragrance of tea and ink in the shop. Ning Kei walked into the calligraphy and painting shop and put the fried chicken he bought in the previous town on the table. He looked at the slightly hunched shopkeeper and said, "Have a drink with me?" Qiao Xiaoshu turned around and looked at him. He shook his head, but still took 2 wine cups. Zhang San and Li Si heard the noise and rushed to the front of the shop. When they saw that it was him, they couldn't help but jump in fright. They subconsciously looked around and used their fastest speed to lift the door plank and close it before coming to greet him. "Greetings, youngest uncle." Ning Kei nodded and gestured for them to fill their own bowls with rice wine. He said, "The butcher is in the Peach Mountain, and the drunkard is chasing after senior brother. Don't worry about those things." Qiao Xiaoshu said, "It took me a long time to set up this trap." Ning Kei said, "So you should be careful?" "Well, I admit that I came here today to break this trap. I don't want you to continue with it." Qiao Xiaoshu said, "Can you kill him?" Ning Kei was silent. With the drunkard's limitless and immeasurable state, even if eldest brother and third sister joined hands, they might not be able to kill him, let alone him. "I'm going to the north. I feel that something is wrong." He looked at Qiao Xiaoshu quietly and said, "Go back to Chang'an. Your wife, children, and the old man are waiting for you." Qiao Xiaoshu did not respond. He raised his wine cup and said, "Drink this cup." Ning Kei drank it up to show his sincerity. Qiao Xiaoshu said, "Then leave." Ning Kei was driven out of the small town. He had to continue walking north with the stone statue. He did not know the specific location, but he knew it was in the north. The small town was between the Song and Yen. Not far from the small town, he entered the Yen territory. There was a river parallel to the Sisui River, flowing from the north to the south into the Great Swamp, and then into the Big River, and finally into the sea. Ning Kei rode the big black horse and galloped between the fields and hills on the east bank of the river. It was early winter, and the water in the river was condensed. The fog was thick, especially in the morning. It was not like the human world. Ning Kei felt that he saw his own reflection in the fog. The fog on the river seemed to have become a mirror. It was not until the morning sun rose and the fog dissipated that he realized that there was no mirror in the fog. It was not his own reflection on the other side of the river, but a man on a horse like him. That man was also dressed in black and rode a black horse, looking very similar to him. The only difference was that Ning Kei wore a black academy uniform, while that man wore a black divine robe. That man was Long Qing. In fact, I wanted Qiao Xiaoshu to say, "Let's go." Ning Kei said, "Let's go." Then he drank the wine in the cup. When Qiao Xiaoshu drank, Qiao Xiaoshu said, "Then you go." "I feel uncomfortable, but this chapter is well written. I am sure of this, so I feel a little comforted." Chapter 11:17. The title was purely made up of idle associations. Please forgive my divergent thinking. I'm sorry to tell you that master has caught a cold and is not feeling well. Plus, he has been in a state of anxiety recently, so he has decided to take a break today and think about the plot later. Please forgive me, dear readers, I'm sorry. Chapter 11:18. This river had many names. It was called the Wei River in the 20 miles around the Tang border. It was called the Yi River in the Yan Kingdom, also known as the Juma River. In the Song Kingdom, it was called the Tong Tian River because one of its tributaries flowed directly into the Storm Sea. The Song Kingdom always insisted that it was the main river and completely ignored the fact that it was still more than 700 miles away from the Great Swamp. No one called it the Great River because there was already a great river in the south of the human world. But this river was actually very large with abundant water and wide waves. The wind blew through the paddy fields and the flowers bloomed on both sides. It had nurtured countless people. Especially in the area before and after the Yan border, the river was extremely wide. No matter how good one's eyesight was, it was difficult to see the face of the person on the other side of the river and naturally could not recognize who it was. But Ning Ke looked at the other side of the river and recognized that it was Long Qing. It was an indescribable feeling, as natural as the great river flowing into the sea, or perhaps it should be said that it was only natural. The world was so big and the Yi River was so cold. There were frequent wars and fires of war. Those who should have escaped had long escaped and walked in the wilderness. But someone appeared on the other side of the river. Of course, that person could only be Long Qing. The big black horse stopped and Ning Ke looked at the other side. At the same time, Long Qing also stopped and looked at him. Their eyes met on the surging river. He did not say, "So you are also here," but simply said, "I see you, so you can't leave." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke pulled the reins lightly and continued to gallop north. Long Qing also galloped north on the other side of the river. His horse was obviously extraordinary as it could keep up with the big black horse. Ning Ke was a little hungry and stopped at a bend in the winter sky. He took out some dry food and began to eat with the river water. Long Qing also stopped and took a few sips from his wine bag to quench his thirst. Ning Ke stopped and picked up some branches to make a bonfire. He allowed the big black horse to wander around and rest while he sat by the fire to roast the wild wheat. He roasted it until it was slightly burnt and fragrant. Then he threw it into his mouth and began chewing. Not long after, a bonfire was also lit on the other side of the river, which was particularly eye-catching in the early night. Ning Ke woke up when the morning sun shone on the earth. He walked to the shore and scooped up a handful of chilly river water. He washed his face and looked up, only to see Long Qing drawing water with a leather bag. He did not even look at him. Ning Ke continued north while Long Qing continued to follow him on the other side. The two of them did not speak, maintaining absolute silence. There was no threatening look in their eyes, not even a hint of hostility. Naturally, there were no flying swords, arrows, peach blossoms, or divine talismans. Deep in the Yan territory, the river turned west and entered a valley that was not high. The river was much narrower than yesterday, and the people on the other side could see it more clearly. Ning Ke and Long Qing and Ning Ke were still as they were. Whether it was the left bank or the right bank, the banks of the river always looked the same. There would be water plants, sand, stone steps in populated areas, bluestones used to wash clothes, waste thrown into the river by people on boats, rotten vegetable leaves floating on the surface of the water, and winding lines. But the two sides of the river were always parallel to each other. They would only meet each other if they went back to the source or entered the great swamp or the sea. Enemies were often the most similar to each other. They had been competing with each other for many years and seemed to know each other very well. But in fact, they had never really touched each other. They just looked at each other. The higher they went upstream, the colder the wind became, and the narrower the Yi River became. Ning Ke could already see Long Qing's eyebrows and eyes very clearly. He could see the scar that had faded a lot. Long Qing could also see the few very inconspicuous freckles on his cheeks and the straw rope wrapped around the hilt of the iron cutlass on his shoulder. 2 days after entering the North Yen mountain range, they reached the end of the mountains and the end of the river. There was endless fog, like white clouds rising from the ground. It was as beautiful as a fairyland and covered both of them. There was an angry sound of water coming from the clouds, crashing into the cliff and shattering into countless pieces. One could imagine how steep the invisible river became in the valley. Ning Ke got off the horse and looked at the other side of the fog. He did not know if Long Qing was there. At this moment, Long Qing's voice came from the fog. "What did you write?" Ning Ke and Long Qing were considered by many to be lifelong enemies. In fact, their fates had always been intertwined over the years. The two of them rarely met, but every time they did, it would be a matter of life and death. Every time they met, the outcome would affect them, and even the broader fates and futures. They met by the Yi River and walked silently on both sides of the river. They did not say a word but only compared each other by the bonfire. They did not start to talk until they reached the end of the mountains and could not see each other. However, Ning Ke did not expect that the first thing Long Qing said would be this. It made his pupils shrink. What did Ning Ke write with the blood of the barbarians on the grassland outside the city of Wei? He went to the Lank temple and saw the stone broken into 3 halves in the autumn rain. Did he write? If he did, what did he write? Was it the last volume of the Doctrine of the New Stream that was handed to Chen Pipi? Or what? Everyone is in the West Hill. Why did you come here? Ning Ke did not answer Long Qing's question. Although Long Qing's first words had exposed his thoughts, he felt that the proverb did make sense: the person who knew you best was often your enemy. Long Qing's voice came from the fog again, "Because you are here." Ning Ke's expression did not change. He untied the iron bow on his shoulder and seemed to want to rest here for a while. Long Qing's meaning was very clear. For Taoism or the human world, the final battle in the West Hill Divine Palace was important, but it was not as important as Ning Ke's whereabouts. Many people are guessing when I will go to capital Cheng to kill you. But I don't think so. Other than the fact that I don't like being watched, the more important reason is that I am not sure that I can kill you. I know you will not go to capital Cheng to find me, so I have been waiting for you at the border. There are countless idiots in the world who always think that there will be a battle between you and me. Have you become so stupid that you have to act according to the plot in the story? I have said that I am not sure that I can kill you. Besides, I have killed Ada and Hengmu. It is boring and monotonous to kill them in order. It is not in line with the aesthetic of the academy. Ning Ke calmly looked at the iron bow on his knees. He did not know when, but a dark iron arrow from the quiver was already in his hand. The whole process of taking out the arrow did not make any sound. He was telling the truth. Long Qing was indeed very powerful now. How could a person who even eldest brother could not see through not be powerful? More importantly, the Abbey Dean had given Long Qing the most important mission of killing Yi Su to help him become a sage. It was not easy to kill such a person, so why would he take the risk to kill him? However, Ning Ke knew that he was also very powerful. According to the proverb, Long Qing should know that he was powerful and not easy to kill. He did not want to fight with Long Qing, so why did Long Qing stop him? You killed people all over the world because you were looking for someone. Others might not understand, but I do. You killed Hengmu and Ada just to find her. You always thought that since they said it themselves and the whole human world was talking about them, that they were her gifts or children in the human world, then you could get some information by killing them. Deep in the clouds, Long Qing's voice sounded again after a moment of silence. I am different. I am not a gift left by Haotian to the human world. From that moment on, I am not qualified to be her son. Of course, I am not interested in such a title now. I am nothing. I have betrayed her. I only believe in myself. Under such circumstances, it is meaningless for you to kill me. Why take the risk? Ning Kei's fingers gently stroked the bowstring that was as hard as stone and as stable as a mountain. He said, yes. Long Qing said, you will not come to kill me, but I will come to you, because I feel that you are getting closer to finding her. I have different thoughts from the headmaster. I think you are the most likely to find her. I cannot let you continue. I don't care what you are going to write in the end. I cannot let you write any more. Ning Kei raised his head and looked deep into the clouds. He said, you think highly of me. Long Qing's voice came, those who look down on you are all dead. Ning Kei was silent for a moment and said, I used to look down on you when you wanted to be her maidservant. Long Qing said, yes. Looking back at that time and thinking about her identity, I am so stupid and arrogant. Ning Kei said, you used the word idiot first. You are so strong that I have nothing to say. Long Qing said, thank you. Ning Kei continued, later on, I shot you on the snow cliff, but you survived. You survived shamelessly. You made me vigilant because I also survived like that. In fact, you almost killed me in the autumn rain at the Red Lotus Temple. Long Qing's voice sounded a bit regretful, but I still couldn't kill you. Ning Kei said, now that I think about it, it is all God's will. Long Qing agreed, Haotian was always by your side. God's will belongs to you. Ning Kei said, if I were you, I would not be convinced either. Long Qing said, nothing. Ning Kei said, otherwise, why are you here now? He had asked this question before and Long Qing had already answered it. In order to prevent him from finding Sang Sang, in order to prevent him from writing that word, for Taoism or the human world, for many glorious, great, and just things, but he repeated his question. Long Qing was silent for a long time, and then gave a new answer. Yes, this is an unnecessary battle. Haotian, Taoism, the human world, and the word you wrote are all excuses. I just want to see if I can kill you now, because I am not convinced. In the clouds, his voice was very calm, as if he was a naughty child who had torn off his clothes and played in the mud by the river naked. It was so real that it made people sigh with emotion. It was silent, except for the sound of the water. Ning Kei stood up and looked at the source of the voice in the clouds. He did not speak for a long time. Long Qing also did not speak for a long time. The world was very big. They did not meet many times, but every time they met was unforgettable. Ning Kei won 3 times in a row. Ning Kei won 3 times in a row. Because of the iron arrow, Long Qing became a disabled person. He abandoned his fiancée and became a devil in the darkness. He learned the gray eyes skill and betrayed Taoism. He thought he had mastered it and ambushed Ning Kei in front of the Red Lotus Temple. He did not expect Ning Kei to learn the practice of Tao Tai. Even if they were like 2 wild dogs biting each other, Ning Kei still won. There were many stories after that, generous, bitter, glorious, and heavy. They walked separately on both sides of the river according to their different fates, survived with difficulty, and continued to shine. They really met at the end of the mountain and sat down to discuss Taoism. It was not about the Taoism of life and death, but only one word. He was not convinced. Since there was Ning Kei in the world, why was there still a need for him? Long Qing was not convinced. This story had gone on for too long, and it was time to end it. It did not matter whether there was a reason or not. Ning Kei quietly looked at the depths of the clouds and felt the willpower, feeling very emotional. He had felt that willpower in many places. For example, the bottom of the Daming Lake, and the cliff cave in the back of the mountain of the academy. He did not expect that Long Qing's unwillingness was so strong. He respected him very much. He raised the iron bow, aimed at the position confirmed by the conversation, and pulled the string without hesitation. With a buzz, the iron arrow left the string and disappeared instantly. His expression was still as calm as before, calm and cold-blooded. He said some words, recalled some of the past, and felt some respect and emotion. "But, I still want to kill you. Since you have been unconvinced for so long, then please continue to be unconvinced until the netherworld. It's not like the occasional cold my wife mentioned yesterday. Although it's an occasional cold, the cold is extremely severe. It's a good thing that I've spent the entire day writing this plot. Naturally, there will be some readers who won't be very happy about it, but I really can't write anymore. The main reason is because this plot itself, in my opinion, is complete. More importantly, after writing the plot, I have a serious sense of mission completion. I feel like tomorrow will be a new day, blah, 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 I love you all." Chapter 11:19. The clouds were thick and the fog was thick. Only the sound could be heard, but no one could be seen. It was a good time to have a heart-to-heart talk, to review their lives, and to sigh with emotion. Even if they didn't want to forget the enmity, they should at least appreciate each other. Then they would straighten their clothes, point their swords at each other, and finish a lifetime of fighting as equals. Who would have thought that Ning Ke would suddenly attack with his strongest iron arrow? At such a beautiful moment, he used the most shameless sneak attack. If there was an audience, they would definitely be amazed by his shamelessness. A soft buzzing sound came from the steady string of the iron bow. The iron arrow pierced through the air and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The river hidden in the clouds splashed, and a clear and terrifying arrow hole appeared in the clouds. The opposite bank was in front of the arrow hole. There was no one and no sound. The iron arrow directly swept over the shallow hills on the opposite bank, flew to a faraway place, or fell into the storm sea. Ning Ke's calm and even cold-blooded sneak attack did not gain anything. Because his enemy today was the one who knew him best. He knew his shamelessness and coldness, and would not give him such a chance. But there were still some things that he didn't understand. Long Qing had been talking, and Ning Ke had been staring at the source of the sound. How could he be sure when Ning Ke would shoot and avoid it in advance? The arrow hole gradually disappeared. The chi of heaven and earth that was held hostage by the arrow dispersed in all directions, bringing with it countless tiny gusts of wind. Tens of thousands of tiny gusts of wind gathered together to form a violent current. In the whistling sound, the clouds and mist gradually dispersed. Looking at the opposite bank that was gradually becoming clear, Ning Ke's expression became very solemn. Many people appeared on the other side of the river. They were so densely packed that they looked like ghosts hiding among the rocks. These people exuded a powerful aura, and their eyes were dark and cold. Hundreds of gazes were coldly staring at him. The scene was extremely strange and terrifying. These powerful cultivators who followed Long Qing were now like a pack of wolves that had been hungry for many years. Ning Ke saw Long Qing. The man who had quietly said that he was not convinced and made everyone think that he would seek a fair fight with Ning Ke was now standing at the back of hundreds of powerful cultivators. He was very cautious and extremely dangerous, just like the aura exuding from his body, which gave people an indescribable feeling of complexity. The iron arrow missed, but it was like a signal that the battle had begun. Hundreds of cultivators rushed into the raging river amidst the deafening battle cries. The river upstream was not deep, just knee-deep. For a moment, water splashed everywhere, and the momentum was extremely frightening. Ning Ke did not draw out his iron cutlass. Instead, he held one end of the iron bow and waited silently. The first to arrive were naturally the flying swords. Several shining Taoist swords pierced through the chilly air and the remaining mist. With a hissing sound, they pierced toward his body. Ning Ke did not look at the Taoist swords. He only stared at Long Qing, who was gradually retreating into the depths of the forest behind the crowd. He did not even blink when the Taoist swords left several bright marks in his eyes. Several Taoist swords stabbed into his body almost at the same time. A series of strange sounds rang out from the shore. The sound was so loud that for a moment, it even drowned out the sound of the raging river. The sound was like a child holding a blunt knife, trying to cut open a pork trotter that had been smoked for 10 years, but could only watch in vain as the blade slid across the tough surface, leaving no mark. The sharp Taoist swords could not pierce through his skin at all. In an instant, Ning Ke burned the connection between the Taoist swords and the sword master with Haotian's divine flame. Accompanied by those strange sounds, the Taoist swords bent and then fell to the ground like scrap iron. He walked forward and suddenly saw that there was a cliff at the end of the valley after the mist dispersed. Under the cliff was a blue kidney sea, which looked very familiar, as if he had been there before. Yes, he had been there before. It was the place where he first met Mo Shanshan and the girls of Black Ink Garden. He suddenly missed her. Since Sang Sang left the human world, he had not thought about her and the other girls for a long time. But today, when the mist dispersed and the blue lake appeared, he suddenly missed them. He did not understand why. Or was it because he was not sure that he could defeat Long Qing, even if he left the shore? Although bones could be buried everywhere in Green Mountain, it was not a bad thing to die here, so he could look back a little. Those cultivators who came to attack on the river were the real powerhouses of Haotian Taoism. They had fought with Long Qing in the Yen kingdom of the eastern wilderness for many years, so their fighting spirits and willpower were not ordinary. At this time, seeing Ning Ke's body was as hard as steel and could completely ignore the cutting of the Taoist swords, they did not feel any fear, nor did they slow down for a moment. The angry river was crushed by the footsteps. Hundreds of powerhouses of Haotian Taoism came from the other shore. They called back the Taoist swords flying in the air, held them tightly in their hands, and stabbed at Ning Quebec. This was the truth that Ji Haoran and Liu Bai taught all cultivators in the world: the closer the natal sword was to oneself, the better, so that the connection would be really close. The closer one was to the enemy, the better, so that he could ignore all defenses. A middle-aged man in leather armor, holding a sword, jumped to the air in front of Ning Ke with an indifferent expression, and chopped down without any fancy moves. The sword was so fast that it did not even have time to make a sound as it tore through the air. This sword was interesting and very powerful. No matter how powerful Ning Ke was, he could not completely ignore such a sword. He looked at the middle-aged man and felt that he was familiar. He remembered that he was a cavalry commander who was expelled from the Divine Hall of Judgment by Yi Hongyu, and was also one of the so-called fallen commanders who later became feared by the world. Ning Ke directly raised the iron bow, held the bow with his left hand, and his right hand fell on the string smoothly. He pulled it casually, and with a light buzz, the bowstring vibrated back to its original position. The cavalry commander was puzzled, because there were no arrows on the iron bow. How could he kill? The next moment, the cavalry commander's face became extremely pale, and a flash of light flashed in his gray eyes. With a roar, he pulled back his sword to protect himself, because he felt the killing intent. There were no arrows on the string of the iron bow, but there was a killing intent. Ning Ke released the string, and there was a sharp killing intent breaking through the air. With a soft sound, a clear corrosion mark appeared on the sword in the hand of the cavalry commander. With a crack, the sword broke in the middle. Then, a thin line of blood appeared on his wrist. Like a ripe fruit falling off the branch, the cavalry commander's hand fell to the ground. Ning Ke raised the iron bow and smashed a cultivator who tried to attack from the side to the ground. Without hesitation, he pulled the bowstring again and released the string at the cavalry commander who had just fallen to the ground. There was a light buzz, and someone was playing the zither. There was a line of blood on the cavalry commander's body. The line of blood ran from his left shoulder to below his ribs, and it was extremely deep. The next moment, the upper half of his body slipped from the lower half of his body, like a falling mountain. At this moment, the two sides of the turbulent and violent river were quiet for a moment. Today's cough is too uncomfortable, so this is all. Chapter 11:20. Who said that one could not kill without arrows? Many people would say so. When the sound rang in front of the river bank where the clouds and mist had dispersed, no one in the world had ever seen an empty string kill. Because when Ning Ke used the killing intent on the string to cut the commander's surname Z into dozens of pieces of flesh in the autumn rain in front of the Red Lotus Temple, Long Qing and his subordinates were fleeing down the mountain and did not see that scene. In the autumn rain, Ning Ke knew his destiny. From that moment on, he had the ability to kill with a bowstring. However, he had not used it in the following years. He had hidden this ability in the deepest part of the arrow case. It was only today when he faced the powerful cultivators that he revealed it to the world. Hundreds of powerful cultivators rushed over fearlessly. Ning Ke pulled the bowstring in silence. There was a soft hum. A heavy iron cutlass was cut in half. The powerful cultivator holding the cutlass had his right arm cut off. He let out a painful howl and fell into the river, unable to maintain his balance. A middle-aged man in a Taoist robe roared. The green sword in his hand turned into a swimming dragon, bringing the river water with it and the vigorous aura of heaven and earth towards his face. He raised the iron bow and pulled the bowstring at the swimming dragon formed by the river water. There was another soft hum. The water dragon was cut in the middle. A crack appeared on the middle-aged man's Taoist robe. The crack expanded rapidly and blood spurted out, dyeing the river water red. He fell heavily into the blood water and could no longer stand up. A powerful cultivator in a leather robe from the eastern tent pulled the bowstring and aimed at the opposite bank across the river. Ning Ke did not even look at it. He pulled the bowstring and shot. The killing intent swept through the surging water. It was wet and had a blurry shape. It arrived in front of the opponent at an unimaginable speed. With a crisp crack, the bow in the hands of the strong eastern tribe barbarian broke in the middle. The bowstring split into two pieces and scattered in the air. The scattered strings were even more beautiful than the water splashes. The broken bowstring hit him hard in the face, smashing right into his eyes, causing a mixture of blood and juice to splatter out. However, the powerhouse from the eastern tent did not cry out in pain or wail. That was because the killing intent attached to Ning Ke's bowstring did not dissipate after cutting off his bow. Instead, it continued forward and directly cut off his neck. His head fell into the river like a stone. He only needed to bend the bow and did not need to put an arrow. It was a fake shot, but it had real killing intent. This was how Ning Ke killed people with the iron bow. His movements were steady. His right hand turned into a shadow. Neither sword nor arrow could be faster than the killing intent. Not to mention that killing intent was invisible and intangible. How could one guard against it? The rushing river water was instantly dyed red with blood. In just a single exchange, several experts had fallen to the ground. With his lightning-fast movements of controlling the bowstring, no one was a match for him at all. Ning Ke looked at the figure of Long Qing, who was about to disappear into the forest in the distance, and walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of cultivators had all come to his side, and the bloody battle continued. Ning Ke looked at the figure of Long Qing who was gradually disappearing into the forest in the distance. He walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of powerful cultivators had all come to his side. The bloody battle continued. Countless sword talismans, knives, and arrows danced in the air, cutting the air above the river into a turbulent cyclone. Just like the rushing river, there were countless dangers hidden in it. Even with Ning Kei's strong body, he still suffered some injuries under such a high density and intensity of attack. His black academy uniform was already torn and blood could be seen faintly under his ribs. But his expression was still calm. He walked silently to the other side of the river. He held the bow with his left hand and controlled the string with his right. From time to time, he raised his arm to aim and pulled the string with his right hand. The entire movement was stable to a perfect degree. He was not disturbed by any attacks. Those attacks wanted to kill him, but they could not kill him instantly. Therefore, those who wanted to attack him were all killed by his iron bow. No matter how sturdy the armor the person was wearing, or how strong his body was after practicing martial arts, he could not stop the bloodline from penetrating the deepest part of his flesh and bones until he was cut in half, or his limbs were severed, or he died. No one could stop Ning Kei from moving forward, not even those who risked their lives to attack. Hundreds of powerful cultivators were even forced to retreat by him alone. Hundreds of people were led to retreat by an iron bow. The sound of the string kept ringing, buzzing like the sound of a zither. It was very similar to the sound that rang in the square in front of the White Tower Temple in Yueluan Kingdom. The only difference was that eldest brother had broken hundreds of bowstrings that day in order to prevent Ning Kei from being killed. Today, Ning Kei kept pulling the string to kill people as quickly as possible. As he walked and shot, blood splattered and some people fell into the river. Ning Kei walked to the middle of the river. He stood on a slightly protruding rock and looked at the forest on the other side of the river. The river wind blew his hair. He was so silent and powerful. The 200 or so powerful cultivators who were still alive were either standing in the rushing river or on the shore. They looked at him with complicated expressions and temporarily stopped their attacks. It was not easy for an ant to shake a tree. I am invincible in the world. This sentence was used to describe Liu Bai. Ning Kei had not reached that state, but with the iron bow in hand, who in the world could be his opponent in close combat? Ning Kei looked at the forest and said, "Since you are not convinced, you should stand up and fight with me. Why send these people to their deaths?" Long Qing was not by the river. He was in the forest behind the cliff. He looked at the bloody scenes on the river in silence, his expression calm and serene. Ning Kei was very powerful. Although Ning Kei's ability to kill people with only an iron bow was beyond his imagination, he had expected this person to be so powerful, so he was not moved. When Long Qing heard Ning Kei's words, he didn't get angry because he was humiliated and mocked. Instead, he smiled silently because he knew Ning Kei was joking. He and Ning Kei would never appreciate each other because neither of them was a hero. They would never fight for the crown like Jun Mo and Yi Su because they were not gentlemen. Ning Kei used the most powerful primordial 13 arrows to sneak attack. How could he say that he was outnumbered? Long Qing knew his shamelessness. In order to defeat him, he had to be even more shameless. He could do anything to win. He could even sell his soul. What else could he care about? Taoism was already in a precarious situation. He would not return to Peach Mountain. The northeast border military of the Tang Empire had penetrated deep into the Yan territory. If his brother made a mistake, capital Cheng would be slaughtered. He would not return to the old capital. He did not care about these. He only cared about Ning Quebec. Why? Because he was not convinced. How could he be convinced? Of course, he did not want to defeat him openly. He wanted to kill him. If he died, he would naturally be convinced. Between him and Ning Kei, the one who died first had to be convinced. Long Qing understood this. So did Ning Quebec. So Ning Kei's words were just a joke. That was why he laughed. Long Qing laughed because he knew he was about to win. Ning Ke had used up all his fu paper in the city of Wei and the Great Spirit in Qinghe Prefecture. He could still write fu, but he did not have any fu paper. If he wanted to write divine fu, he would need to use his psyche power. He could still use Haotian's divine light, but he did not have the Great Spirit that he had accumulated for many years. If he wanted to absorb the qi of heaven and earth into his body, he would need to use a lot of psyche power. Everyone knew that Ning Ke was the same as Yi Hongyu. They were both peerless geniuses who cultivated in several sections. After Xiaoho, it was difficult for anyone to force him to use all his trump cards. It was even more impossible with his current state. However, he had traveled thousands of miles to kill people. Even if he meditated and recovered in the Lank Temple for a period of time, it was impossible for him to be as powerful as when he had just left Chang'an. He could not regain some skills in a short time. What Long Qing wanted to do was to force him to use up his psyche power. He lured Ning Ke to shoot the iron arrow. He made hundreds of the last, most loyal and most powerful subordinates attack fearlessly and die one after another. All this was to use up Ning Ke's psyche power. Psyche power was the foundation of cultivation. It was the firewood for fighting. It was everything. No one had ever thought of using up their psyche power to defeat Ning Quebec. This was because his psyche power was extremely powerful. This was also something that many people knew. However, Long Qing dared to think this way. Because only he knew a fact. No one's psyche power could be stronger than his. Not even Ning Ke. Tomorrow, my wife will be here. Everything will be better. I will recuperate as soon as possible. Then, I will gather enough energy to write the ending of the night. Please encourage me. Thank you. Chapter 11:21. Long Qing's confidence lay in the fact that he never fought alone. There were many people in his body, and there were also many people by the river. They were the powerful cultivators from Haotian Taoism and the Eastern Royal Court. They were not ordinary cavalries. Even if Ning Ke could fight against thousands of people, he could not completely ignore the attacks of these powerful cultivators. Ning Ke also noticed that the situation was a little strange today. None of the cultivators chose to retreat when faced with his iron bow. Instead, they were fearful of death and attacked wave after wave. The cultivator whose arm was cut off by Ning Ke changed his weapon to another hand and attacked again. The cultivator whose leg was cut off jumped and continued to attack with his companions. Those people looked pale. Every time they jumped, a lot of blood would splash out. They could die at any time, but they did not care. It was a horrifying scene. The horrifying scene meant a horrifying fighting will. Ning Ke stood on the reef and kept pulling the bowstring. He shot the enemies who approached him into the turbulent river. His expression did not change, but his heart was slightly stirred. How could such a strong and inhuman willpower appear in these people? Suddenly, he noticed that there was something wrong with the eyes of these powerful cultivators. They were not black like the ordinary people of the Central Plains, nor were they brown like the barbarians. Instead, they were a very strange gray, as dim as the lead clouds in the sky. More than 200 powerful cultivators rushed toward the river, surrounded and attacked. No matter how badly they were injured, they were calm and even a little numb. There was no fear in their gray eyes, only a desire to devour people and even an aura that was close to self-destruction. Looking at these hundreds of pairs of gray eyes, Ning Ke felt that he was surrounded by hundreds of hungry wolves. The surrounding air became a little cold, and he became very vigilant. The movements of his hands gradually slowed down. Slowing down the movements was not to slow down the attack, but to achieve the best effect with each attack. It would be best if he could directly cut off the opponent's waist or neck. If not, then he must at least cut off one of the opponent's legs to make it difficult for them to move and slow down their wolf-like attack. He was so cautious because he felt a sense of crisis deep in his heart. At this time, the river was full of Taoist swords and arrows. The chi of heaven and earth was cut into chaos by hundreds of psyche powers. No matter how fast his attack was, he had to pay a price every time, even if it was a wisp of psyche powers or a strand of hair. No matter how small the price was, it would still affect the final outcome of the battle. For example, an ant's nest was like a 1,000-mile-long dike, or an iron spoon was like a sturdy prison cell. Ning Ke had to be careful. Moreover, the gray eyes of these strong cultivators reminded him of the horrifying cultivation method that Long Qing had cultivated. He would not forget that Long Qing had not made a move until now. He must be hiding in the forest waiting for a chance. The river was still flowing fast, and the clouds had dispersed without a trace. There was no scorching sun in the sky, only a faint light, illuminating the battle on the cliff and the blue kidney sea not far below the cliff. Ning Ke continued to walk to the other side of the river. People kept falling in front of his iron bow, but at a much slower speed than before. His footsteps became heavier and heavier, just like his dignified expression. Long Qing was indeed looking for a chance, and he was sure that the chance would appear. He and Ning Ke knew each other too well. Conspiracies and tricks did not make much sense. Their states and cultivation methods were exposed to the sky and the sun. The so-called game could only be an open game, and then everything could be calculated. Under the continuous attacks of hundreds of strong cultivators, no matter how strong Ning Ke's psyche power was, it would inevitably be gradually consumed. No matter how cautious he was, he would eventually reveal a loophole. The mottled shadows of the forest leaves fell on Long Qing's face, as if adding countless scars. He quietly and attentively watched the battle in the river and watched Ning Ke walk down the reef toward him. Ning Ke's movements were still so steady, and his footsteps were also so steady, but too steady. He raised his hand to play the bowstring and threw his feet into the water. The rhythm was so precise that it was hard to imagine. However, it was this absolutely precise rhythm that gave off a slightly stiff feeling. The feeling of freedom that Ning Ke had shown at the beginning of the battle had unknowingly been worn away by the blood and broken limbs. He could only rely on precision to control the entire battle. If he wanted to control it, it meant that he was about to lose control. This was the chance that Long Qing had been waiting for. Suddenly, a cold and deadly cold wind blew through the forest. A dozen or so birds screeched in fear and scattered in all directions. However, before they could fly over the treetops, they were frozen stiff by the cold wind and fell to the ground. A thin layer of frost appeared on the ground. The frost extended out of the forest until it reached the river bank. It froze the first few waves that came ashore, and then thousands of layers of snow appeared. Long Qing's figure was like a ghost. He appeared on the rapid river and appeared in front of Ning Quebec. Behind him were two tracks that looked like ruts, faintly imprinted on the frost. The strange phenomenon of ice and snow on the river bank in the forest was caused by him releasing all the aura of quietus without hesitation at this moment. He rushed to Ning Ke at an unimaginable speed. At this time, Ning Ke had just pulled the string of the iron bow and shot a strong warrior from the eastern wilderness in half. He had just lifted his right foot and was about to step on the wet reef in front of him. He raised his hand and then threw his foot. There was a rhythm in between, which was not broken by the horrible sword intent and blade wind on the river. As long as he maintained this rhythm, he could keep moving forward without stopping. Long Qing had the power to break his rhythm, and it was at the most critical point of his rhythm. A silent black peach blossom, with an indescribable sense of quietus, descended from above and blasted toward Ning Ke's face. Ning Ke's left hand held the bow handle, and his right hand had just left the bowstring. He was in the follow-up movement of grasping the bird's tail. In a flash, Ning Ke retracted his right hand and held the lower end of the iron bow. His left hand held the middle part of the iron bow, and he pushed his hands forward to block the black peach blossom. The whole movement was done in one breath, as if he had already expected Long Qing to appear at this moment. But only he and Long Qing knew that it was not a matter of course. His rhythm was broken, and his psyche power was consumed. His right hand that grasped the bird's tail wanted to support the mountain, but after all, it was not enough. Long Qing stood on the reef and looked at him expressionlessly. His feet were as steady as roots. Ning Ke was in the river, and his right foot had not yet landed on the reef. He was swaying unsteadily. The dark iron bow was against the black peach blossom. The rushing river was quiet for a moment at this moment. Then, there was a loud bang. The black reef under Long Qing's feet was broken into countless pieces. Terrifying waves of air surged out in all directions. There was a clear deep plowed mark on the surface of the river. It was the mark of the water being cut open. It was the mark left by Ning Ke's feet on the surface of the river when he was shaken away. He swept across the river like a stone and smashed heavily into the cliff. Smoke and dust filled the air, and the earth shook. The river began to flow again, and it was still as rapid as before. Long Qing stood in the river. There was a lot of dust and water on his black divine robe. He was wet, and his hair was messy. His face was pale, and there was blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. He looked extremely embarrassed. However, his eyes were so bright as stars. Because he looked at the cliff on the other side of the river. The smoke and dust had dissipated, and there was a dark hole there. No one knew how deep Ning Ke had been smashed into the cliff. Long Qing knew that Ning Ke was not dead, but he knew that he had won this head-on battle without any tricks or skills. It was purely a contest of psyche power and state. This was important, so he smiled a little. After a moment, Ning Ke's voice came from the cliff. He sounded a little tired, but still stable. You used so many loyal subordinates to consume my psyche power, and then sneak attacked me. That's too shameless. I see that you are smiling now, and you seem to be very proud. Ning Ke walked out of the cliff and said to Long Qing in the river. His front was full of blood, not from the shock of the iron bow, but from coughing. Long Qing looked at him and smiled without saying a word. Those powerful cultivators, like hungry wolves, did not wait for orders. They passed by him and killed Ning Ke on the other side of the river. The sound of killing shook the sky again, and the aura of heaven and earth was cut into countless pieces by swords, knives, and arrows. Long Qing would not give Ning Ke any time or opportunity to meditate and recover his psyche power. The sound of the iron bow overwhelmed the sound of the surging water again, and began to harvest lives. Everything seemed to be the same as before. But in fact, everything was different. Ning Ke's movements were still stable, but more stiff. He still looked calm, but there was an emotion deep in his eyes that no one could understand. Those powerful cultivators were obviously controlled by Long Qing's secret method, or at least given some restrictions. After their eyes turned gray, their strength did not increase, but their willpower became extremely terrifying. They really pestered Ning Ke to the extreme, and if they were not killed or smashed, they would cause trouble for Ning Quebec. In many people's minds, as long as one's state was high enough, he could kill all enemies in the world. But they never thought that as long as one was human, he would always be tired, and his psyche power would eventually be exhausted. Ning Ke's psyche power was gradually consumed. It was not exhausted yet, but there were signs. At the moment when the signs appeared, the breath of death appeared on both sides of the angry river again, and the cold-resistant fish under the stones were all frozen. Long Qing came to him again. A black peach blossom bloomed and came to his face. Ning Ke did not smell the faint fragrance of the flower, nor would he appreciate the beautiful black petals. He stared at Long Qing behind the black peach blossom. His right hand, which was grasping the bird's tail, did not forcibly retract to hold the iron bow. Instead, he took the opportunity to hold the handle of the iron cutlass in the cold wind. There was a clang. The sharp iron cutlass was unsheathed, and the cold wind on the shore paused for a moment, and then tore it apart. He did not look at the black peach blossom that was rushing toward his face, but only stared at Long Qing behind the flower. The iron cutlass passed through the black peach blossom and cut toward Long Qing's face. He was very clear that if he let the situation develop, he might be exhausted to death. Even if he killed all of Long Qing's subordinates, it would be difficult for him to survive after Long Qing gained the upper hand. No matter how he looked at it, it was difficult to survive. Then, they could only die together. He looked at Long Qing. He sent an invitation. There's more today. I'm writing slowly. I'm not very sure when the next chapter will come out. Chapter 11:22. If they couldn't live together, they had to die together. Apart from describing lovers who would live and die together, it was also sometimes used to describe enemies who couldn't live under the same sky. However, at that time, people would usually change the expression to fight to the death. In fact, when they were in a state of fight to the death, they would often end up dying together. Ning Ke did not care about the black peach blossom that was flying towards him. He directly slashed at Long Qing's face and invited him to die together. He did not really want to die with Long Qing, but he believed that Long Qing would not die with him. So he had to avoid it, and then he could turn the whole situation around. He was very confident about this because he was born in a grassroots family and had struggled between life and death since he was a child. He knew better than anyone that only those who were not afraid of death would not die. On the other hand, Long Qing was born in a noble family and had finally climbed to the peak of life. How could he give up everything in such a short time? Even if Long Qing had learned a lot in the process of climbing out of the abyss and had a new understanding of death and loss, he should also know that in terms of physical strength, few people in this world could be stronger than Ning Quebec. He could not gain any advantage in this kind of brutal killing, so he should also retreat. No matter how he thought about it, Long Qing should retreat and choose to avoid his iron cutlass. Ning Ke thought so. Therefore, when the faint black peach blossom was not affected at all and resolutely broke the wind and blasted towards his chest with the seemingly endless aura of heaven and earth, he was very puzzled. An intense pain came from his chest and spread around. It was a power that seemed to tear everything apart and directly broke his ribs. Blood kept gushing out, and the world in front of him turned blood red. At the last moment when he could avoid dying together with Ning Ke, Long Qing, who had the initiative, did not choose to retreat. Instead, he silently continued to attack, but for some reason, the spade fell on Ning Ke's chest. With a loud bang, Ning Ke's black academy uniform was torn into countless pieces. Blood splashed wildly, and his lips, nostrils, eyes, and ears kept dripping with blood. At the same time, Ning Ke's iron cutlass also fell. It landed heavily on Long Qing's forehead. An extremely terrible muffled sound. He did not wear a silver mask, but his face seemed to be wearing an invisible mask, which was constantly resisting the cutting of the blade. An extremely shrill sound suddenly sounded. Long Qing's face instantly turned pale. His eyebrows and eyes were twisted, as if he was in extreme pain. A shrill howl burst out from his thin lips. The endless aura of heaven and earth was summoned by him and blasted towards Ning Ke's chest and abdomen through the black peach blossom. Ning Ke was covered in blood. His eyes were dyed red, but he was still calm. He endured the pain that ordinary people would find hard to endure, and used all the strength in his body on the iron saber. The sharp blade went deeper into Long Qing's face, and a stream of blood flowed down. Long Qing's howl became even more shrill, like the howl of a wild wolf in the wilderness, and also like some kind of mournful wail. His eyes became incomparably dark and his eyebrows fluttered in the wind. His face seemed to be undergoing some sort of change as his aura gushed out madly. He was about to turn into another person. Ning Ke felt an unprecedented crisis, but he remained silent and continued to slash. Long Qing's roar continued, and his face kept changing. It was as if he could turn into countless people at any time. Following his transformation, a terrifying force covered his face and blocked the iron saber. A black peach blossom fell, and a black iron saber fell. Although there was no immediate outcome of life or death, they both stood on the edge of the cliff. The process seemed to be very long, but in fact it was very short. The cultivators on both sides of the angry river had no time to help Long Qing. The two had separated, and the battle had been decided. Naturally, the outcome was also clear. A deafening sound rang out, and the river flew into the sky like a reverse waterfall, shaking up several water curtains that were hundreds of feet high. The mossy stones in the water tumbled and collided with each other, and then shattered. A deep pit appeared on the left bank of the river. Ning Ke fell at the bottom of the pit, bathed in blood, and many bones were broken. Long Qing stood outside the pit with a solemn expression. His face was covered in blood, and he looked like a devil. "Do you think I'm afraid of death?" There was no expression on Long Qing's face. After saying this, a trace of pain suddenly appeared on his face. He bent down and coughed up 2 mouthfuls of blood. Then he stood up fiercely and repeated, "Do you think I'm afraid of death? To betray one's beliefs is to live a life worse than death. There are countless kinds of psyche power in my body now, and they are struggling with each other. I live a life worse than death every day. Do you think I'm afraid of death?" He roared angrily at Ning Ke, as if he was venting something. "But you're still afraid of death." Ning Ke held on to the edge of the pit and stood up. He looked at him and said. He had suffered such a serious injury, but he still did not fall. It had nothing to do with his state, but his spirit. As Long Qing said, his great spirit had turned into the happy wind in Qinghe Prefecture, but his spirit was still there. Long Qing did not expect him to still be able to stand up. He said, "I admire you." At this time, there were still dozens of cultivators by the river. They did not die under the iron bow, and they still had the ability to fight. During the short conversation between the two, they all rushed over and raised their swords to attack Ning Quebec. Today's battle seemed to be between Ning Ke and Long Qing, but in fact, those cultivators whose states were far lower than the two of them played a very important role in it. The so-called maggots in the bone were just like maggots in the bone. Ning Ke reached out to wipe off the blood on his face. As his palm fell, it swept past his chest and abdomen, and was covered with more blood. Then, he stretched out in the air in front of him and spread his fingers. The blood turned into countless tiny drops of blood along with the movement of his fingers and floated around. The river wind blew gently, and he used the blood to write in the wind. His face suddenly became extremely pale, and even the blood on it could not hide it. Countless extremely fierce and sharp talisman intent instantly enveloped the entire river bank. The cultivators around him let out painful, angry, and unwilling howls. They were like war horses that were stopped by a tripwire. Their broken legs and arms fell to the ground one after another. The painful howls mixed with the sound of the river, and it was especially ear-piercing. Long Qing's expression did not change. He reached out and waved in the air. The Taoist sword in the hands of a Hautian Taoism priest who had fallen dead in the river came to him. It turned into a clear light in front of him and cut off the last talisman intent that had quietly attacked him. Ning Ke's expression did not change even though his sneak attack did not succeed. He looked at him quietly and said, "You see, I can still fight." Long Qing stretched out his right hand in the river wind and said, "Please." The angry river suddenly became quiet. Because there were angry talisman in tents and sword lights everywhere on the river bank. After an unknown period of time, Ning Ke finished writing the talisman. Hundreds of broken Taoist swords were scattered in front of Long Qing. The two of them faced each other from a distance. They were covered in blood, their faces were pale, and they were both very tired. It was rare to see such a scene in a battle in the cultivation world. The two of them were so close in their states and knew each other so well that they could only fight with brute force until they were exhausted. They were really exhausted. It was quiet for a long time. The river flowed and sang a song that no one knew what it meant. "Can you still fight?" Long Qing asked in an extremely hoarse voice. Ning Ke was silent and looked down at the pool of blood at his feet. "It has always been said that your psyche power is more powerful than Lu Bai's. I did not believe it, but today I do. I have spent so much time and so many subordinates have died to exhaust you." Long Qing said with a faint smile, "But, you have exhausted yourself, haven't you?" Ning Ke looked up at him and said, "What about your psyche power? Can you still have it?" Long Qing was seen through, but his expression did not change. He said, "You failed to kill me with that knife. You have lost." Ning Ke suddenly laughed. This was the first time he laughed since the beginning of the battle. "That just means that you are thick-skinned." Long Qing said calmly, "This is also an advantage. The problem is that we both have no psyche power now. Why do you think you can defeat me? You should know that I was already very good at killing when I did not know how to cultivate." Ning Ke took off the iron bow and looked at him. He said, "When you took my knife just now, your ankle was broken into pieces. So you can only stand where you are. How can you dodge now?" After saying this, he pulled the bow and prepared to shoot. His psyche power was exhausted and could not shoot the primordial 13 arrows. But he could still shoot arrows. As he said, when he was Mr. 13 of the Academy, he could kill people with a snap of his fingers. When he was a soldier at the border of the city of Wei, he was also good at killing people. Killing people had nothing to do with psyche power. At this moment, he was only dozens of feet away from Long Qing. There was no barrier between them. Long Qing's ankle was broken and he had been standing there for a long time. How could he avoid Ning Ke's iron arrow? If this was Long Qing's trap, then Ning Ke was the one to break it. His way to break the trap was to go with the flow and achieve his goal according to Long Qing's method. From the very beginning, he knew what Long Qing wanted to do. He was very cooperative. He took the risk, got injured, and continued to cooperate with Long Qing. At the end of the battle, both sides had exhausted their psyche power and became ordinary people. When they were ordinary people, Long Qing was the prince of the Yan kingdom. But he was the woodcutter of Shubi Lake. Looking at the iron bow in Ning Ke's hand, Long Qing slightly narrowed his eyes. His emotions became extremely complicated. Ning Ke looked calm and was ready to draw the bow. He felt that the word "draw" was really good. The battle between him and Long Qing had lasted for several years since that banquet. He had won several battles, but he knew that it was not natural. It was not that he was born to be stronger than Long Qing, or that he was Long Qing's nemesis. It was because of lucky chance or God's will. After Long Qing was defeated by him, many people in the world began to despise Long Qing, except for him. Even though he seemed to not care about Long Qing, in fact, he cared about Long Qing very much. Since he had already won, he did not want to lose to Long Qing again. Because he knew that Long Qing was strong in everything. Among all the enemies in his life, he valued Long Qing the most. When he found Long Qing in the Red Lotus Temple, he did not hesitate to shoot 7 arrows. This was a treatment that no one had ever received. Many years ago, the real feud between them started with the iron arrow on the snow cliff. Many years later, he was ready to end it with the iron arrow by the river of anger. Long Qing suddenly laughed. It was not until then that Ning Ke really saw clearly that the complex emotions in Long Qing's eyes were nothing else but a combination of mockery, contempt, sympathy, and some confusion. A person whose psyche power was exhausted, unable to move, and could only wait to be shot to death by the arrow would not have such an emotion. This kind of emotion only belonged to the winner. Those emotions disappeared in the next moment. Because emotions had colors, and Long Qing's eyes had no color. There was no black, no white, no light, no evil, just a gray. It was like the sky of Qingjing City in winter when every household burned coal. It was like a Taoist scroll that was wet and could not be dried again. It was chaotic, gray, evil, and horrible. His right hand hung by his side. Several Taoist priests were on the riverbank in the direction of his right hand. They were dying. All of a sudden, the facial features of these few heavenly officials twisted in pain. Long Qing closed his eyes and took a deep breath, looking very intoxicated. When he opened his eyes, there seemed to be many more souls in his gray eyes. He looked at Ning Ke and waved. Countless grains of sand on the riverbank flew with the wind, making a sizzling sound like thousands of sharp arrows. Clap, 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 clap. There were dense sounds of hitting, and countless bloody holes appeared on Ning Ke's body. The iron arrow fell at his feet. He could no longer stand and knelt on one knee. Your biggest mistake is being too confident. Do you really think that your psyche power is the best in the world? Maybe I used to be, but not after I cultivated the gray eyes. I have thousands of incarnations and countless psyche power. How can you be my opponent? Long Qing walked towards him, and his broken ankle seemed to have recovered. Behind him, countless blurry faces vaguely appeared. He walked to Ning Ke, spread his hands, and pointed at the seriously injured cultivators and corpses on the riverbank. He said, "As long as I want, I can get psyche power at any time. I brought them to kill you, first to consume your psyche power, and also to replenish myself at the last moment. They are my food, and they could have been yours." Long Qing looked at Ning Ke and said, "This is a feast that I have arranged for you and me. I don't understand why you are still unwilling to enjoy it at the last moment. If so, then you can only be the last main dish." "Why not?" "Because human flesh is not delicious." Ning Ke coughed out 2 mouthfuls of blood in pain. Only then did he know why Long Qing was confused. Long Qing must have been waiting for him to use the practice of Tao Tai to deal with his gray eyes, just like in the autumn rain in front of the Red Lotus Temple many years ago. But he did not expect that it would still be useless even when he was at the end of his rope. He looked at Long Qing and continued, "I have eaten your flesh, and it is not delicious either." Long Qing had long been prepared for Ning Ke to use the practice of Tao Tai. For this reason, he had used some tricks on the cultivators by the riverbank. But he did not expect that Ning Ke did not move, just because of such a simple reason. Is it important, whether it is delicious or not? Very important. Ning Ke said, "My teacher taught me many things, but I only remember this one." Long Qing said no more. He raised his right hand, and the riverbank was shrouded in the aura of quietus. Hundreds of cultivators, regardless of whether they were alive or dead, began to tremble slightly. His eyes became darker and darker. In a very short time, he regained his strength. He pulled out his life-bond sword from his tattered black divine robe. The sword that looked like a black peach blossom. The sword, or the flower, was born from the hole in his chest. He finally defeated Ning Ke today. Ning Ke was about to die. This made him extremely happy, and he was overjoyed. So the black peach blossom on the sword was in full bloom, extremely beautiful. In the process of the black peach blossom blooming and then falling, Ning Ke thought of many things. This was not the backtracking of time before his death, because he did not think that he was about to die. He just thought of the academy's climbing test. At the wooden door, Long Qing should have seen that a gentleman did not compete, but he saw that a gentleman did not use a tool. What was the academy's no-tool spirit? He had asked Chen Pipi about it, but found that it was a very mysterious concept, and everyone's understanding was different. The metaphysical was called the Tao, and the metaphysical was called the tool. The no-tool was the Tao? Or was it not rigidly bound by rules, like the headmaster of the academy, who really had no rules? Ning Ke still had a long way to go before he could reach the state of no rules and great freedom. But at this moment, he vaguely understood some of the truth. There were many things in the world that could not be calculated. Just like Long Qing, no matter how carefully he calculated, there would still be many accidents. For example, in this feast, he still refused to raise his chopsticks. On the contrary, if he only followed his heart and did not think about the consequences, he might have a better ending. What was the point of thinking so much about the so-called trump card and the so-called response? When Ning Ke was thinking about these things, he still lowered his head and half knelt at the bottom of the pit. His right hand was full of blood, and he held the iron bow. He waved the iron bow and waved it forward. He did not look at it, nor did he think. He waved it casually, but it was so free and easy. Long Qing wanted to avoid it, but found that he could not. Ning Ke waved the iron bow, as if he had written in Chang'an. It turned out that writing talisman was really the same as writing. The more unintentional, the better. The chicken soup calligraphy had no owner when it was written, so it was best to make everyone feel touched. His waving was unintentional, so he could not avoid it. There was a crisp sound. Long Qing's ankle, which had been barely repaired, broke again, and his body tilted and fell. The iron bow in Ning Ke's hand had already passed through the river wind and was around Long Qing's neck. Long Qing shouted and held the Taoist sword backward, using the black peach blossom on the sword hilt to block the tough bowstring. The two fell on the river bank, and the blood on their bodies was smeared with mud. Ning Ke lifted his right knee like lightning, pressed it against his back, and pulled the iron bow, trying to strangle him with the bowstring. Long Qing held the black peach blossom sword upside down, and the sword edge was about to touch his chest. He forced out all the psyche power in his sense of perception and summoned countless auras of heaven and earth, but he could not get out. Ning Ke's power seemed to be especially terrifying at this moment. There seemed to be only two ways for Long Qing: to be strung by the iron bow, or to be stabbed to death by his own sword. There was a soft sound. The sword edge pierced through his clothes and stabbed into Long Qing's body. But he did not die, because there was a hole in his chest and abdomen. The dark black sword pierced through the hole. There was a puff. Ning Ke's chest was pierced by the sword edge, and blood gushed out. The hole in Long Qing's chest was made by Ning Ke with an arrow. Now he used this hole to stab a deep bloody hole in Ning Ke's chest. Or was this cause and effect? The bowstring was only an inch away from Long Qing's neck. The black sword was also only an inch away from Ning Ke's heart. The choice was in Long Qing's hands. If he did not use the sword hilt to block the bowstring, the sword edge could continue to penetrate into Ning Ke's body, but then his neck would also be cut by the bowstring. The choice was also in Ning Ke's hands. If he did not continue to strangle Long Qing with the bowstring, then Long Qing's sword would not continue to penetrate into his body. This was a true sharing of life and death. In the mud on the river bank, there was only the sound of rapid breathing, and only the silent struggle for life. They were all people who survived like wild dogs. No matter how high they climbed, in the end, they still had to bite each other like wild dogs. Long Qing could not turn his head, and asked while panting, what method did you use when you waved the bow just now? Why couldn't I avoid it? Since it has nothing to do with psyche power, why didn't you use it before? Ning Ke said behind him, the Academy's no-boundary spirit. Long Qing asked with a trace of cruelty, what now? Die together? Ning Ke said, I don't mind. During the short conversation, the two were actually still exerting force. The bowstring made a squeaking sound, and the sword edge pierced into Ning Ke's body slowly. Long Qing suddenly said, you don't dare, because you don't want to die, and you still want to find her. Ning Ke said, not wanting to die doesn't mean that I am afraid of death. What you said proves that you are afraid of death. Long Qing seemed to be greatly insulted, and shouted angrily, how can I be afraid of death? Ning Ke said, at the beginning, your natal peach blossom did not hit my face, but my chest. Because you lowered your head, you only dared to use your forehead to meet my knife, but not your neck. Long Qing panted and said, so what? You lowered your head, but I didn't. Ning Ke took a few breaths of the air with the smell of mud, and said expressionlessly, so you die, and I live. As soon as he finished speaking, he used all his remaining strength to pull the bow backward. Long Qing let out an angry roar. The bowstring fell on his neck, leaving a clear line of blood. The black sword edge pierced into Ning Ke's chest, piercing his heart. An indescribable and absolute pain spread throughout Ning Ke's body, making him tremble uncontrollably. His face was as pale as snow, and his lips were as black as ink. He screamed in pain. Ah! Ning Ke screamed in pain, and his hands kept pulling backward. A light sound was heard. Long Qing's neck was broken. His whole body lost its strength, and he lay on the mud like a puppet falling apart. Ning Ke breathed rapidly, and his eyes were a little unfocused. His hands holding the bow kept trembling. It was not until a long time later that he became slightly sober. He let go of the bow with difficulty and rolled to the side. There was an extremely deep bloody hole in his chest, and his heart was seriously damaged. He curled up into a ball in pain, hugging his arms, and kept trembling. The wind by the river was cold and refreshing, because his heart was exposed in the bloody hole. Long Qing was lying beside him. He looked at the dark sky with confusion and bewilderment. At this moment, his eyes were no longer gray. Compared to this long story, the ending was so simple and came so quickly. Just as Ning Ke said, if Long Qing was not afraid of death, his black sword could definitely pierce through Ning Ke's heart by combining his strength with Ning Ke's. But then he would also die. These years, Long Qing lived in pain, but he did not want to die. At the last moment, he still did not want to die. So he died. Chapter 11:23. Thick clouds covered the sky, making it dark and gloomy. In the distance, at the bottom of the cliff, the blue kidney sea was tranquil and beautiful. No one disturbed it. The stream between the cliffs flowed unbridledly, emitting rumbling sounds. It seemed extremely cheerful. After a long time, Ning Ke woke up. His face was extremely pale due to the loss of blood, and he looked confused. It took him a while to really wake up and remember what had happened. He covered his badly wounded chest with one hand and tried to stand up, but found it very difficult. Such a simple movement took him a long time and brought him endless pain. His academy uniform was tattered, and the blood all over his body was frozen by the cold air. He looked like a ghost who had just escaped from hell. After the battle, the big black horse rushed out of the forest and stayed by his side. Seeing his weak appearance, it hurried to his side and supported him with its warm and solid body. Ning Ke gently stroked its neck with his left hand and forced a smile to express his gratitude. Then he looked around and saw corpses everywhere on the beach and in the river. But the blood and the water had been diluted, so it was hard to see. The hundreds of cultivators, who were as terrifying as hungry wolves, were all dead. Many died under his iron bow, and many more died under Long Qing's hands. The faces of the dead had a very strange grey color, and they looked very haggard. It should be the result of Long Qing absorbing all of their psyche power. Ning Ke noticed that there were dozens of dead birds beside the corpses of the priests. There were still some traces of blood and flesh in the birds' beaks. It seemed that these people had been implanted with some kind of poison. Long Qing's body was at his feet. It was still staring at the grey sky, unwilling to die. He did not have the habit of collecting the bodies of his enemies, but he wanted to find something on Long Qing's body. He squatted down and began to search carefully, but he found nothing in the tattered black robe. Unexpectedly, he found that there were some faint golden reflections in Long Qing's wounds. He frowned slightly, not understanding what they were. He picked up the iron arrow on the ground and pierced it into Long Qing's body. He picked out the golden things and found that they were very thin golden threads, and there were more than one. They were everywhere. Ning Ke only knew that a madman in the cultivation world had done something similar. Yi Hongyu had planted many golden threads in her body to counter his practice of Tao Tai. He did not expect Long Qing to do the same. The poison implanted in the bodies of those cultivators and the golden thread implanted in Long Qing's body were naturally a trap for him. In the previous banquet, Long Qing had used the grey eyes to absorb the psyche power of his subordinates. If Ning Ke had responded with the Tao Tai, he would have fallen into his trap. No one could predict the outcome of the battle. Ning Ke looked at Long Qing's eyes, which were brighter after death than when he was alive, and remained silent. There were many key points in today's battle. He had refused to use the Tao Tai, which was completely out of his opponent's expectation. A long time ago, he and the headmaster of the academy had talked about this matter. The master and disciples' attainments in food were as different as heaven and earth, but they had reached an unprecedented consensus in this regard: human flesh really did not taste good. They were able to have this kind of discussion because both master and disciple had done such crazy things before. Of course, if it really came to a moment of life and death, such as when he carried Sang Sang on his back to escape in the barren land many years ago, or he would still eat anything, what would the Tao Tai be? The reason why he did not use it today was that he always thought Long Qing would have other means, the strongest one. That was also the reason why he searched for Long Qing's body. Unexpectedly, he did not find it. The Sha hand scroll of the tomes of arcane had always been with Long Qing. In the capital of the kingdom of Song, he used this tomes of arcane to break the river and mountain sandbox of Fourth Brother. There were still some remnants of the tomes of arcane, but where was it now? The academy now attached great importance to the 7 tomes of arcane, or to be exact, the 6 tomes of arcane in the hands of Taoism. When Yu Lian and Zhu Nemo were looking for the butcher in the small town in front of Peach Mountain, they were also looking for the Fall hand scroll of the tomes of arcane in the hands of the middle-aged Taoist. So did Ning Quebec. Now that they had confirmed that the tomes of arcane were not with the original owner, they must be in the hands of the Abbey Dean. What did the Abbey Dean want to do with them? Needless to say, they must be extremely important. Ning Ke stood where he was and thought for a while. When he recovered a little, he patted the big black horse's neck. The big black horse knew that he was ready to leave, so it did not wait for him to turn over. Instead, it slightly bent its front hooves and arched to the side. Then, it lifted Ning Ke, who was exhausted and powerless, onto the saddle. Then it stepped on the soft river bank and left. Holding the big black horse's neck, he noticed that its front hooves were stained with blood. Thinking that Long Qing's horse was missing, he seemed to understand something. Then, his attention was attracted by the clouds and mist that appeared between the cliffs again. The big black horse ran down the cliff and continued northward along the Blue Kidney Sea. It stopped by the steaming hot spring for a night. Ning Ke soaked in the hot water and meditated to make sure that his injury would not worsen. Then, he was relieved. He leaned against the edge of the pool and looked at the floating hot mist. He did not think about the stories that happened many years ago. Instead, he felt that the mist was very similar to the clouds and mist in the cliffs. There was no difference. This battle was very bloody and tragic. But he also learned something. For example, he understood a saying. At the end of the mountain and the end of the river, there were white clouds. There was no need to think about whether there was a path in the depths of the clouds. There was no need to think about whether there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was no need to look for villages and hunting villages. He thought so the moment he waved the iron bow and did so. It was not necessary to be more evil to defeat evil. It was not necessary to be more violent to defeat violence. It was not necessary to use the practice of Tao Tai to defeat the gray eyes. Follow your heart, and you may see freedom. This might be the real no-boundary spirit of the academy. It was also the true meaning of the 4 words that the headmaster of the academy let him see on the stone behind the wooden door. It was also a kind of teaching. Ning Ke understood. He knew very well how important it was. If he really wanted to write that big character one day in the future, he must understand this truth. This battle also gave him some psychological hints. Because it was too painful, too bitter and too miserable, he always felt that this should be the last pass before he traveled thousands of miles to see Tianyan. He took out the stone statue and looked at Sang Sang, who was lying quietly in the mist. He said quietly, "You have to wait for me." After leaving the Blue Kidney Sea, Ning Ke rode the big black horse and continued northward. The eastern wilderness grassland was full of charred tents and corpses of warhorses. The desolate man defeated the last cavalry of the left king's palace, so no one would disturb him. It was strange that he did not go to the desolate man for supplies or clues. He seemed to be extra careful. He went all the way to the north and came to the valley guarded by Helan City. He stopped the big black horse and looked around to see that there was no one around. He put his finger to his lips and blew a very clear whistle. The sound of the whistle traveled far into the mountains and ridges. Some birds were startled, some beasts growled, and then there was the sound of hurried hooves going far away. Ning Ke waited in the same place for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, when the sun had just risen, a very handsome wild horse galloped in the morning light. Its long mane danced in the wind and its strong body was drenched in sweat. It looked very beautiful. "It is much more handsome than you." Ning Ke looked at the wild horse and said to the big black horse. To his surprise, the big black horse only snorted and did not make any more aggressive moves to express its opposition, such as acting coquettishly or acting cute. The wild horse galloped to Ning Ke and stopped in front of him. It lowered its head and sent a message. Ning Ke recognized that this horse was one of the 8 horses in front of the black donkey's broken chariot. He reached out and patted it to express his gratitude. Then he began to read the message that Gaga had ordered countless creatures on the grassland to inquire about. The big black horse approached the wild horse and tried to show affection by rubbing its neck. The wild horse raised its head to show its pride and disdain, but it did not leave. Ning Ke then realized that this unusually handsome wild horse was actually a female horse. Gaga used some unknown means to make a human understand its consciousness. It even made the human write a letter. The words in the letter were very simple and the meaning was very clear. In the cold north, the most cunning snow fox and the most vigilant snow chicken are dying one after another. There are no wild horses and snow wolves that have seen the beast that is good at hunting, but there must be such a beast. Ning Ke finished reading the letter and looked to the north. It was the same as what the stone statue had predicted. They were all in the north. The headmaster of the academy once said that the north of all places was in one place. No one found any trace of her, but they found traces left by a fierce beast. That beast was either an indigo dog or an indigo lion. Ning Kei's expression did not change, but his hand holding the letter became a little stiff. He turned over and mounted the horse, lightly clamping its belly, and headed north. The handsome wild horse quietly saw him off at the entrance of the gorge. The big black horse lowered its head and looked a little unhappy. Ning Kei said, "I know you want to find a companion, but I have to find mine first." The wind and snow gradually became stronger as they headed north. Ning Kei calmed himself down and was cautious and silent. He did not meet with the desolate man and even paid attention not to leave any traces on the snow. He did not want anyone to find his whereabouts and thus find her. He moved forward in the mountains abandoned by Haotian. He was the person abandoned by Haotian. In other words, he had abandoned Haotian in the human world. Now he was going to find her. He arrived at the hot sea. There was no heat, only thick snow and bone-chilling coldness. Ning Kei led the big black horse and walked in the wooden houses abandoned by the desolate man. He recalled the scene when the headmaster brought him and sang here and the wedding witnessed by Master Heaven and Earth. The stone statue in his arms was also very warm, which told him that he had come to the right place. She should be here. But where was she? He walked to the window of a wooden house and looked at the dark snow sea and the unimaginably high mountain. There was an oil lamp in the window. Sang looked at him quietly. Her face was like the silver moon, illuminated by the dim light. She could see him. He could not see her. They were people from two different worlds. Ning Kei stood by the window for a long time, until his eyebrows were dyed white by the snow. When he walked to the forest, he suddenly stopped. He looked at a place under the tree and his hand holding the reins began to tremble. The more I wrote, the more cautious I became, and the more I didn't want to continue. I really love the people at night. Last night, after Long Qing died, I was able to sleep peacefully. This is the truth. I also love you very much. Chapter 11:24. Just like the title. That leave slip was awesome. It was called The Last Deep Breath. I wrote it full of murderous intent. I even coolly pulled monthly votes at the end. In the end, I realized that I had forgotten to post it. Oh my. I'm guilty. I apologize to everyone. Especially to my friends who waited for me yesterday. I cried as I went to work. I've let everyone down. I've let down my weeping blood chapter. Today's update would be around 8 p.m. sharp. Chapter 11:25. Yesterday, I forgot to post my request for leave. It's really a sin. Although I often stop updating, I have never stopped updating without asking for leave. That's because I'm worried that the readers will wait for me to update and waste their time. I didn't expect to make such a big mistake. I'm really sorry. I still have one more chapter today. I'll be writing very slowly. Write slowly and seriously. Also, this chapter is quite sour and kind of, but I really like this style. There were some leftover chicken bones under the tree. Ning Kei looked at those chicken bones and was silent for a long time. The big black horse snorted uneasily and looked back at the wooden hut, feeling a little uneasy. Ning Kei suddenly turned around and led it back to the wooden hut. He pushed the door open and entered. The hut was still dark without a trace of light. It was empty and there was no one. Ning Kei let go of the reins and walked to the window, looking at the snow sea. The oil lamp on the table was lit. Sang Sang looked at him quietly. He still couldn't see her, but he knew she was here. So he began to speak. Long Qing is dead. He paused for a while and continued, in the north of Yen Kingdom, I killed him. I didn't expect it to end so easily. In my original plan, I was going to disable him and then lock him in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine so that he would never be free, just like what youngest uncle did to Lotus. But after thinking about it, it didn't make sense. He didn't really offend me, except that his attitude towards you was a little bad and he tried to threaten me with you. But none of that happened. Lotus killed Xiao. He didn't hurt you. My reaction was a little too intense. Ning Ke turned around and looked at the dark room. He said, ever since I found you beside that barkless mulberry tree, the most intense emotions in my life have been because of you. At first, I wanted to kill my grandpa. Then, I came to Longqing. Now that I think about it, when I first entered the city of Wei, I fought several times for you. Sang Sang was very close to him. If there was no barrier, they could hear each other's breathing. Listening to his words, her expression was still cold, but her eyelashes fell slowly. She seemed a little tired. I went to the Lank temple and carved a lot of stone statues, your statue. Ning Ke took out the stone statue from his arms and put it on the table in front of the window. He said, I don't know if you still remember what you said in the temple when you were sick. But I still remember it. Sang Sang looked at the table and at herself, who was sleeping on her side, with a curious look in her eyes. Of course, I went to the city of Wei first. I always thought that it was more important to you and you might stay there. Unfortunately, I couldn't find you. Well, I killed a lot of people there. Ning Ke suddenly stopped. After a long silence, he said, I don't want to talk anymore. It's meaningless to cry and stab myself to force you to come out. Anyway, I'm here. He looked at the empty darkness in front of him and said, come out. There was no need to be emotional, no need to reminisce, just a calm request, just like in the past many years. You bring me tea, you pour me water, you put your feet in my arms, and let me touch them. In the quiet wooden house, there was an almost inaudible sound, as if the thinnest paper was cut by the sharpest knife, or the most brittle glass fell from the sky to the ground, breaking and then opening. The dim light gradually filled the whole room, from a trace to tens of thousands, and finally illuminated the whole wooden house, the stone statue lying on the table, Ning Ke's face, and her figure. Ning Ke looked at her, who he hadn't seen for a long time. He looked at her swollen waist and her simple animal skin clothes. He felt inexplicably sad and stepped forward to hold her tightly in his arms. Sang Sang expressionlessly let him hold her. She raised her head, looking extremely arrogant, or perhaps dull. Let go, she said. The indigo lion rushed out from the corner, its forelimbs bent, and it was about to pounce, growling threateningly. The big black horse stared at it from above. Its eyes were violent, and its meaning was clear. The indigo lion quickly stopped growling and became well-behaved. Ning Ke held Sang Sang and buried his head in her neck. His voice was a little muffled, but it was very clear. The muffled tone meant that it was clear, and the meaning was unquestionable. No. Sang Sang said coldly, let go. Ning Ke said, no. Let go. Let go. Let go. No. I said I won't let go, and I won't let go. The big black horse and the indigo lion looked at each other and sensibly walked to the corner, pretending that they didn't see or hear anything. Ning Ke held Sang Sang like this, as if he would hold her until the seas ran dry and the rocks rotted. After an unknown period of time, Sang Sang's slightly raised head finally fell back down. Their cheeks touched each other warmly. After a long time, Ning Ke was sure that the handle of the axe had not rotted into dust. He finally let go of his hands, grabbed her right hand, and led her to the bed to sit down. They sat side by side on the bed, not to share the fruits equally, but if Sang Sang put on the cape, it would look like the night of their wedding. It was here that they had consummated their marriage. "Come home with me," Ning Ke said to her. Sang Sang did not answer him, nor did she pull her hand out of his. She looked at the wind and snow outside the window, lost in thought. Ning Ke knew that she was not lost in thought, because she was a god, and she was still here. "Come home with me," he repeated. Sang Sang looked at him and asked expressionlessly, "Which home?" "Your first home." This time it was Ning Ke's turn to be silent. Sang Sang said, "The headmaster wanted to break my world because of his irresponsible desire for freedom. You are so persistent in breaking my world because you want to go back to that home? In fact, I have always wanted to know, when were you sure that you could go back to your hometown after breaking my world?" Ning Ke held her hand tightly, thought for a while and said, "In fact, I have guessed this a long time ago, because there are also stars here, and the headmaster finally became the moon." Sang Sang slightly raised her eyebrows and asked, "What does this mean?" "He became the moon because you told him about the moon on the sea that year, and he thought the moon was beautiful. That's all. There is wind and snow." Ning Ke pointed out of the window and said, "And the sky full of stars. These are all very unnecessary things. If your world is a closed and self-contained system, you don't need the 4 seasons. But you have all these long ago. Your world is very similar to the one I came from." He withdrew his gaze from the window and looked at her. "There is only one explanation. This world is still in the world that I am familiar with, and it is interconnected, or at least observable, because only by observing can one imitate and be so similar." Sang Sang said indifferently, "You can observe, so I know what your world is like." Ning Ke said, "It is a vast and free world." Sang Sang said, "It is a cold and dead world. The passionate sun spread life, and the boundless universe was waiting to be explored, so it was a vast and free world. But most of the space was filled with absolute coldness and silence, so it was also a cold and dead world." Ning Ke and Sang Sang were not wrong, because they had different standpoints. Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and then said, "The fate of human beings should be decided by human beings. You don't have to continue to bear this responsibility, it is too tiring." Sang Sang said, "I once told you that I love the world, and only the people who love me. The ancestors of the world chose me, so I have to continue to bear this responsibility. This discussion is meaningless." Ning Ke forcefully stopped the conversation, grabbed her shoulders, and said, "You are my wife, and you are pregnant with our child. You should go home with me." Sang Sang looked at him quietly for a long time, and then said, "Do you want me to die so badly?" Ning Ke said, "That day when you sailed to the divine kingdom on the other side of the sea, I tried to do something, but in the end, I did nothing. You should be very clear about my attitude." Sang Sang said, "But I also warned you that I am the aggregation of the rules of this world. If you want to destroy this world, I can no longer continue to exist." Ning Ke said, "I used to be very worried, but not now, because there is Haotian in the divine kingdom, and you have become a person now. You will be fine." Sang Sang looked at him and said expressionlessly, "How can you prove it?" Ning Ke looked at her bulging belly and said, "Isn't this proof?" Sang Sang stood up and walked to the window. She looked into the distance and said, "The new stream has been spreading in the world for a long time, and Taoism is gradually declining, and I am becoming weaker and weaker." What does this mean? It meant that she was still Haotian. Or maybe it is because of pregnancy. Ning Ke walked behind her and said, "Pregnant women are always weak. You should remember that year in the city of Wei, when the fat ant was pregnant, she didn't even have the strength to curse. But you can't prove it." Sang Sang turned around and said, "Then I may still die." When she said this, there was no emotion on her face, and she looked extremely calm and indifferent. But Ning Ke saw great fear and sorrow deep in her eyes. Because of the fear and sorrow, his heart was aching. "I am really afraid of death," Sang Sang said expressionlessly. "From the moment I woke up in the divine kingdom, I began to fear that I would die. I don't want to die." She said this calmly, and tears wet her face. Sang Sang rarely cried. Haotian never cried. Ning Ke forgot how many years it had been since he last saw her cry. Maybe it was years, or maybe thousands of years. He held her in his arms again and whispered, "Don't be afraid. It's okay. I won't let you die." Sang Sang let him hold her like before, and put her hands behind her back. But this time, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "They all want to kill me. They want to kill me, and so do you. I can be killed now, so I am afraid. I am afraid that even you want to kill me." She looked calm, but she kept crying. She was strangely sad. "I won't." Ning Ke hugged her tightly and said, "If you are really afraid, then don't do it. We will go back to another home, not the city of Wei, but Chang'an. The yard of the old brush pen shop is still there." Sang Sang asked, "What about your home?" Ning Ke said, "I have long forgotten. My home is where my heart is at peace. Wherever my heart is at peace, that is my home." Sang Sang was his home. It was like she wanted to go to the other side, but could not return to the divine kingdom. Because her other side was where he stood. Chapter 11:26. Sang Sang was still calm and proud, as indifferent as when she was on the Peach Mountain or in the mortal world. She did not show any extra emotions. In fact, she was very uneasy because she knew what the Abbey Dean wanted to do. Her relationship with Taoism was very complicated. She was the deity worshipped by Taoism and also the gatekeeper chosen by Taoism for human beings. When Taoism decided to destroy her, it meant that the human world would abandon her. She was getting weaker and could be killed now. So for the first time, she felt the reality and sadness of life. She began to feel fear and uneasiness, which eventually turned into sadness. So she shed tears expressionlessly. Fortunately, the night was very dark, and there was a dim lamp lit up because it was the only one. Just like the human world was already dark for her, there was still Ning Ke, the only exception. He was the only one she trusted, because he was her man. Because she had poured tea for him many times, spent a long time with him, and experienced countless life and death situations together. They were already inseparable. Sang Sang closed her eyes and leaned on his chest. She looked a little tired, but the indifference between her brows had been replaced by peace. Since the day she could not return to the divine kingdom, this was the only time she could truly feel at ease. Ning Ke hugged her from behind and said, "We will go back tomorrow. When we arrive in Chang'an, no one can hurt you. Don't forget that you are Haotian. You used to be so fierce to me, but why are you so timid now?" Sang Sang did not answer his question about going back to Chang'an. She said, "I am not as powerful as I used to be, so I have to be careful. As for you, you have been so disrespectful to me, but I did not punish you. You should be grateful." Hearing this, Ning Ke reached his hand down from her hair into her chest and held there. He said, "You are my wife. Even if you treat each other with respect, it should be on the banquet table. We are on the Kong bed." Sang Sang suddenly opened her eyes. A trace of anger flashed in the depths of her eyes, which were as bright as stars. Then she became a little confused. If she wanted to become a human, it seemed that there was nothing wrong with his behavior. Feeling that the hand in her chest was getting hotter and hotter, she frowned. It was obvious that she was not used to it, but she did not know how to deal with it. This kind of intimacy was common in her human memory. From her childhood to Chang'an, especially in that chessboard, she did not know how many times, but she still found it hard to accept. She was considering whether she should continue to remain silent and pretend that she didn't know, or wave her hand to disperse her world and blast him into the depths of the sea of snow to wake him up. For some reason, she chose to remain silent. In order to dispel the discomfort and embarrassment in the depths of Tian Xian's heart, she chose to discuss a relatively cold topic with him. "Chen Mao wants to kill me," she said expressionlessly. As she wished, after hearing this, Ning Kei's hand was still in her arms, but at least he stopped moving. After a while, his voice came from behind her ear. "Are you sure? I know everyone's past, so I know their future. In a closed world, as long as you know all the prerequisites, grasp all the rules, and have absolute computing ability, you can calculate all the results. I understand that." She knew that this was the language used in Ning Kei's world. After hearing it for so many years, she was used to it and did not want to ask. She repeated, "So, Chen Mao wants to kill me." This was a typical reason of Haotian, or a miracle. The Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane was the specific manifestation of this miracle, and it was her declaration to the entire human world. After a moment of silence, Ning Kei said, "Senior brothers and sisters and I have vaguely guessed it, but we can't be sure, because we don't know what he wants to do." Sang Sang did not say it, but it was obvious that she was fully prepared for this. "In fact, I have always been wondering. If you can calculate the future, just like what is written in the Ming hand scroll, you know that the headmaster will turn into the moon, that the Buddha will hide in the mountains, and that the Abidine will find another way. Then why did you come to the human world? You did not completely defeat the headmaster, but you became weaker and more dangerous." Ning Kei held her in his arms and asked in a low voice. Sang Sang said, "I can't calculate my own future. The future I saw in the past is too vague, and I can't be sure, because there are variables." "What is a variable?" "A person like your headmaster who can go beyond the rules is a variable." "It sounds very powerful." "You are also a variable?" "Why?" "Because you are an outsider." The room was quiet for a while, and the wind and snow outside the window kept roaring. Sang Sang was right. In fact, many years ago, when Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, used his lifespan as a substitute to calculate the future, he also saw something special about Ning Kei. He was never in this chess game. He came from another world, and he was an outsider. Haotian could not calculate him, the headmaster of academy could not see him, and the abbey dean was the same. Ning Kei was silent for a long time. He felt that the identity of the headmaster of academy was like some kind of messenger that often appeared in religions, but he did not know whether it was the messenger of light or the messenger of darkness. It was still too heavy, and did not fit the atmosphere of the reunion of the husband and wife at the end of 1,000 miles to find his wife. He decided to change the topic from Sang Sang. "When is it due?" He touched her bulging belly and asked with concern. Sang Sang's answer was very simple. "I don't know." This answer stunned him, and he felt a little strange. He thought to himself, "Don't you know when you don't have your menstruation?" But on second thought, his wife was not a human, and it was indeed hard to explain. If it was calculated according to the 10 months of pregnancy of an ordinary person, he was wearing a very green hat. He stopped thinking about these trivial things and asked another question that was equally important. "A boy or a girl? Do you want a boy or a girl?" Sang Sang did not turn around, but her eyes became a little bright. It seemed that she had thought about these questions a lot during these days of solitude in the cold region. He did not know if she had found that she was really like a human. "Either is fine." Ning Kei thought for a while and said, "But a girl is better. I have more experience raising her." The experience he was talking about was the time when he raised Sang Sang as a child. Sang Sang nodded and said, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. Ning Ke was a little annoyed and said, why don't you know? Ordinary pregnant women knew their due date, but without the help of a doctor, there was no way to know whether the baby was a boy or a girl. But for an extraordinary pregnant woman like Sang Sang, it should be the opposite. Shouldn't Haotian know everything? Because I don't want to know. Sang Sang said in a low voice. She looked a little angry, but it was more like she was acting in a fit of pique. She was still tall and plump, especially after she was pregnant. But lying in his arms and acting in a fit of pique, she looked a little cute, like a little girl. Ning Ke heard more jealousy in her voice. He knew that she was jealous, just like when she ran away from home in Chang'an. But now she was jealous, of the child in her belly. No matter who he was jealous of, it was still jealousy. This was what he wanted to see the most in his life, so he laughed heartlessly and hugged her even tighter. Of course, he was careful not to press against her stomach. The two of them lay quietly on the bed. The stone statue lay quietly on the table. The big black horse and the indigo lion rested quietly in the corner of the room. Not long after, the sky was still dark. But according to the time, it was morning. Ning Ke got up and began to pack up, ready to leave with her. Sang Sang looked at him quietly and did not say that she wanted to leave with him. After packing up, Ning Ke walked to her and said, don't play the game of not taking the initiative, not refusing, and not taking responsibility. No matter whether you want to leave or not, you have to go with me. After saying this, he carried her in his arms. The big black horse was very observant. It jumped like lightning and humbly lowered its body. After Sang Sang rode on it, it turned back and carefully rubbed against her calf to show affection. Sang Sang rode on the back of the horse and looked down at Ning Quebec. She said, do you really think I don't dare to hit you? Ning Ke turned over and got on the horse. He put his hands around her waist and held the reins tightly. He smiled and said in her ear, it's not that you don't dare to hit me, but that you can't bear to hit me. The big black horse buried its head very low and felt that these words were a little too mushy. The indigo lion looked at Sang Sang with tears in its eyes. It thought, how could the great Sang Sang fall like this? The couple rode on the big black horse and left the cold region for the south against the biting wind and snow. The indigo-haired dog followed them closely and ran happily. The route Ning Ke chose was through the snow sea. The frozen sea was covered with 2 feet of snow. Even though the big black horse was tall and strong, it was still very difficult to walk. Ning Ke did not know why he chose this route. If someone could look down from the sky, they would be able to see that they had left a very clear mark on the surface of the sea of snow. Compared to the vast snowy land, this mark was indeed very thin, but it was not covered by the wind and snow again. It was a little strange, and no one knew what kind of method had been used. Sang Sang stood in front of him and looked down at the ground from the sky. She looked at the mark on the snow sea that could not be covered by the wind and snow and remained silent. Ning Ke knew that she understood something and said, I'm just making some preparations. Suddenly, a bubble appeared in front of Sang Sang. Its surface was very smooth and transparent like colored glass. The bubble was very thin, as if it would burst at any time. However, the strange thing was that the bubble did not burst even though it trembled in the howling wind and snow. There were 2 extremely thin cracks on the bubble, as if it would burst at any moment. The 2 cracks were like 2 strokes, 1 stroke and 1 stroke. The cracks were very thin and shallow. If the wall of the bubble was only 1/1000th of the thickness of a hair, then the crack was only 1/1000th of the thickness of the wall. It was impossible for ordinary people to see it. Ning Ke was not an ordinary person. He could see it, so his expression became very serious. He felt that if the bubble burst, the world would be destroyed. Sang Sang asked, can you write that character now? Ning Ke said, no. Sang Sang was silent for a long time and said, let me know when you can. I didn't write a tragic ending, did I? Because, according to science. Chapter 11:28. Ning Ke did not know what to say. He looked at the bubble floating in front of her and thought of the speculations he and his teacher had made on the ship. He asked uncertainly, is this what the world looks like? Sang Sang did not answer. The wind and snow did not stop. The big black horse was very fast. It did not take long for them to cross the snow sea. Ning Ke looked back and saw the clear hoof prints on the snowfield. No one knew what he was thinking. Everyone who walked would leave a trace. This sentence was a bit sour and nonsense. But it was a simple truth for what he wanted to do. Weren't the most important changes of human beings to the world those traces? For example, the city wall, the palace, the fields, and the river bank. The trace on the snow sea was the same. It was also a part of a certain stroke of a word. It could be the beginning or the end. But Ning Ke could not be sure at the moment. Even he could not be sure, unless he really wrote that word and let the whole world see it. But it was not easy to write that word. Looking back at the history of human beings in this world, only the headmaster of the academy was able to surpass the rules and reach the state of no rules. But he had to make some preparations, even if it would take him thousands of years. Before he was sure of the Abbey Dean's real purpose, this was probably the only thing he could do now. Now it seemed that the Abbey Dean asked Long Qing to burn Yi Su to death to help him become a sage, split Taoism, and secretly help the new stream. All of these pointed to weakening Sang Sang. It was obvious that he wanted to harm Sang Sang. According to the Academy's calculation, the Abbey Dean used the tomes of arcane to deal with Sang Sang. But, why? It was not logical to not think about religious beliefs. Sang Sang was Haotian. Why did Taoism want to kill her? Why did they dare to kill her? What was the meaning? Sang Sang did not say, and Ning Ke did not ask. As long as he could return to his home in Chang'an, he would have a lot of time to solve this puzzle and make corresponding countermeasures. The big black horse was so fast that it turned into a black lightning in the wind and snow. The green dog ran in the deep snow and was buried by the snow from time to time. It looked like a blooming green lotus and was not slow at all. A few days later, Ning Ke and his entourage left the cold region and came to a coniferous forest. In the forest, he saw a lot of frozen deer meat and blood left by wild beasts. Looking at the footprints of the beasts and the broken trees, he was sure that this should be the place where the snow wolves had stayed. Sang Sang reached out her right index finger to the big black horse's neck. The big black horse understood and slowed down. She got off clumsily with her hands on her belly and waved. The green-haired dog ran over happily and jumped into her arms. The green dog ran to her happily and jumped into her arms. She held the green dog and looked to the south indifferently. To the dog and of the north of the mountain of the south. It was still snowing in the south, but Sang Sang watched for an hour and then said, "Turn east, 12:8. Ning Ke helped her get on the horse and pulled the reins gently to change the direction of the big black horse. He did not ask any questions during the whole process, as if he knew what she meant. A few days later, Sang Sang stopped the big black horse again when they arrived at an icy river. She looked to the sky in a certain direction with an indifferent expression. But her eyes were filled with irritation. Then she took out an abacus and began to dial. Ning Ke was surprised to see that she rarely used an abacus when she was building a house in Chang'an. She needed a solemn sense of ceremony to boost her confidence because of the large amount of money involved. There were few people and beasts in the snowfield. It was very quiet except for the whistling wind. But at this time, there was a crisp sound of cracking on the icy river. Song Song's fingers left a shadow on the abacus as if she was playing the piano. After a while, she stopped working on the abacus. Ning Ke looked at her and saw that the wooden beads on the abacus were arranged in a very regular but absolutely meaningless pattern. He could not understand it and asked directly, "How do we go?" "To the northwest, 3323. Sang Sang said. Going to the northwest meant going back, but Ning Ke did not doubt it. He lifted the reins and let the big black horse go in that direction, kicking snow and splashing ice all the way without any delay. At dusk, the big black horse stopped again. Sang Sang took out the abacus and began to dial again like playing the piano. When she finished calculating, she gave a new direction and Ning Ke followed it. From the beginning to the end, he did not ask any questions, nor did he have any doubts. He just cooperated with her in silence, just like many years ago. He absolutely trusted her when it came to calculating the route. This situation repeated for the next few days. Finally, Sang Sang did not even put the abacus in her clothes. Instead, she put it in front of the saddle and fiddled with it from time to time. The number of times she changed directions became more and more frequent. She was much weaker than before. Although it was difficult for her to calculate everything in the world, she was still much better than ordinary people when it came to calculating. There was no pattern to the turning and retreating. In the end, even Ning Ke lost his direction. But he knew that they were getting closer and closer to Chang'an City. Sang Sang and the person he did not want to meet had not been seen yet. Ning Ke's expression became more and more solemn, because he knew that everything would get more dangerous in the end. More importantly, he found that Song Song's energy was getting weaker and weaker, and he did not know how long she could continue calculating. Sang Sang became very tired and sleepy. She often fell asleep on his chest while fiddling with the abacus. Fortunately, she was not as weak as she was when she was seriously ill, and she did not vomit blood. Every time Ning Ke looked at her bulging belly, he could not help but wonder if she was going to give birth soon. For the next 2 days, they traveled southward along the Tianqi mountain. The snowy ridge drew a clear, beautiful and undulating line in the blue sky, guiding the big black horse in the right direction. Helan City loomed among the mountains. Sang Sang stopped the big black horse again. This time, the calculation took a long time. The wooden beads on the abacus kept bouncing. They were put back to their original positions by her fingers, and then they were plucked out again. It was very messy. Her movements also became a little messy, as if she was playing the piano at random. The indifference on her face was replaced by annoyance, and finally anger. With a clap, her hand fell on the abacus, messing up the pattern that was about to take shape. She let her messy hair fly around her cheeks, and said, "We will meet." Ning Ke only kept silent for a short time, and then asked, "Is there a chance?" Sang Sang said, "No." He asked about the probability of defeating the Abbey Dean if they worked together. Song Song's answer was very simple and clear. This time, Ning Ke kept silent for a long time, and then said, "Can we go around it?" Sang Sang said, "No." Ning Ke did not doubt her judgment after hearing 2 consecutive rejections. So he dismounted without hesitation and led the reins to the mountains. He said, "Find a way to hide first." Hearing this, Sang Sang slightly raised her eyebrows, a little unhappy. She was Haotian. How could she hide because of a human? And that human used to be her dog? Of course, in fact, she had been hiding by the snow sea for a long time. She could keep her state of mind at that time, but it was very difficult now. She did not want to appear too weak in front of Ning Ke and needed his protection. When her hand fell on her abdomen subconsciously, she kept silent. Ning Ke did not expect that she would still think about these things at this moment. He held the reins and quickly ran into the mountains. He came to a cold lake surrounded by cold trees, and said, "Right here." From here, they could see Helan City from afar, but it was difficult to be discovered by the outside world. Sang Sang waved her sleeves sewn from animal skin. A clear light flashed, and an aura appeared and then disappeared. Ning Ke did not find anything strange, but he knew that she had opened her own world. The flat land by the cold lake, himself, the big black horse, and the green-haired dog were all in this world. It did not take long for him to see the proof. The snow by the lake gradually melted, and the temperature gradually rose. Grass gradually sprouted in the mud. Suddenly, it snowed in Tianqi Mountain. Ning Ke looked at the outside world and felt it was amazing. The wind and snow outside were furious, but here it was as warm as spring. He thought for a while, took out his iron cutlass, and neatly chopped some trees. With his inhuman strength, it only took him a very short time to build a wooden house by the lake. The wooden house was a little shabby, but the faint smell of wood could calm the mind. Sang Sang held her abdomen and quietly watched him work. Hide in the small building and become one. She looked at the shabby wooden house and said expressionlessly, "You know, it is impossible to hide forever. Steal half a day of leisure in a fleeting life." Ning Ke said, "Hide as long as you can. Well, don't recite poems anymore. I taught you these poems when you were young. What's more, you need to rest now." He helped her into the wooden house and let her lean on the soft bedding. He lowered his head against her bulging abdomen, trying to listen to the movement inside. But there was movement outside the wooden house. The Taoist in indigo appeared opposite the cold lake. His face was frosty, and his clothes were snowy. No one knew how long he had been searching in the world and how many places. He looked at the other side of the cold lake quietly. He obviously saw nothing, but he did not leave. Ning Ke raised his head and glanced at him. Then he lowered his head and continued to lean against Sang Sang's abdomen. He ignored what was happening outside and looked extremely focused. Sang Sang ignored him and looked at the other side of the cold lake. She suddenly said, "I really want to kill him." Ning Ke was happy to hear the movement of the fetus. He replied, "You can't kill him now, so don't even think about it." Sang Sang said indifferently, "I can't kill him, so I want to kill him." Ning Ke was startled and thought it was indeed true. If it were in the past, she could kill whoever she wanted. Why would she need to think about it? He sat up and held her in his arms. He looked at the Abbey Dean across the cold lake quietly, as if he was looking at a fake world in a mirror, or a play or a painting. It seemed absurd, interesting, and peaceful. In fact, the world he and Sang Sang were in now was fake. And this world could not be maintained forever. It would eventually break. The moment when Sang Sang could not maintain this world. It was probably the moment when they left this world. Chapter 1129. In fact, Ning Ke had only seen the Abbey Dean a few times in Chang'an. Now that he thought about it, every time they met, it seemed to be accompanied by wind and snow. It was extremely cold from the outside to the inside. In the past, the Abbey Dean's indigo robe was clean and free of snow and frost. He was like an immortal. But now, he was covered with dust and looked tired. He was just like an ordinary person. He had been searching for Sang Sang for many days and places. He had traveled thousands of miles with the distanceless state, but he was still one step behind. Ning Ke and Sang Sang's natal connection was stronger than the strongest in the world. He looked at the other side of the cold pond and the withered grass under the snow. There was no expression on his face. His mind was calm because there was nothing there. But he always felt that there was something there. It was the same feeling he had when he passed by the desolate man's tribe in the snow sea in the past. So he did not leave. The mountain that was abandoned by Haotian became colder and colder in the wind and snow. The Abbé Dean stood by the pond quietly and looked calmer and calmer, as if invisible water had flowed through him and washed away all the dust. The weathered look on his face became lighter and lighter until it finally disappeared. The snow on his indigo robe also melted and disappeared. A pure aura came out of his body and reached his feet. It melted the snow and greened the old grass. It spread to the pond and melted the ice, creating ripples. Spring was coming. The spring wind greened the shore of the cold pond and reached the other side in an instant. Sang Sang looked at him quietly and put her fingers on the ground. The aura of life flowed into the earth like a trickle. The spring outside and the spring inside merged together. Without each other, there was no boundary and they could not be seen. When the dusk came, the Abbé Dean left the pond, leaving a lingering aura of the space passage and disappeared. Ning Ke was relieved when he confirmed that the Abbé Dean did not find Sang Sang in him. But he did not look happy because it was only temporary. No one knew how long this situation would last. Can we go now? He looked at the magnificent Helan city in the distant mountains and asked. Sang Sang did not answer. Ning Ke understood what she meant. The Abbé Dean might have gone to the South Sea, or he might be looking at the earth from the top of the snow-capped peak. If she opened her world, he would easily find her. The abacus was on her knees, but she could not figure out the position of the Abbé Dean. She was becoming weaker and weaker, or rather, she was becoming more and more like an ordinary woman. This fact made her silent, helpless, and even angrier. She grabbed Ning Ke's hand and bit it hard, like a mother beast who had been stimulated. Ning Ke looked at the blood flowing from the corner of her mouth. It was very painful, but he did not cry out. His eyes were full of love and sympathy. As night fell, the wind and snow in the mountains suddenly stopped. A gust of wind came from the sea in the southeast, blowing away the thick clouds in the sky. Hundreds of stars appeared in front of him, and at the same time, there was a full moon. Ning Ke held Sang Sang and leaned against the soft animal skin, staring at the stars and the bright moon in the night sky in a daze. Sang Sang said, "I want to have sex." Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He looked down at her calm face and realized that she was not joking. Of course, if she was really joking, this matter would be a little too funny. He said, "What are you thinking about? Go to sleep first." Sang Sang said, "I want to sleep with you." Ning Ke was startled and asked, "Sleepy?" Sang Sang said, "I want to sleep with you." Her mood was very calm, even a little indifferent. She was not so serious, but extremely serious. Ning Ke held her, smelled her scent, and kissed her face. After a while, he suddenly said, "Can we not watch?" Sang Sang looked at a certain place without blinking her eyes and said, "Why?" Ning Ke said, "What is this? What people do, God is watching." Sang Sang looked up at him and said, "That's interesting." "Interesting? Nonsense. That's boring." "Well, I say, even if you have to watch, can't you show some emotions?" Ning Ke was not in a good mood when he woke up in the morning, because he always felt that Sang Sang's mood was a little strange, as if she was saying goodbye to him. They had just reunited, and she was going to run away again? He thought about it and felt that something was wrong. His expression gradually became solemn, and he was extremely vigilant as he looked across the cold pond at the grassland that had just been in spring yesterday and was frozen by the cold wind overnight. What happened next gave him another possible answer, but it did not make him feel a little relaxed. Instead, his mood became heavier, because Sang Sang seemed to be about to give birth. He had experience in many things, but he had no experience in this matter. Sang Sang used to be omniscient and omnipotent, but there was nothing she could do about this matter. It was quiet in the wooden hut. Sang Sang held her bulging abdomen and felt the movement coming from inside. Her thin brows were extremely tightly knitted, and her face was a little pale. The labor pain had not begun, but it was about to begin. Giving birth was troublesome, and what was more troublesome was that Sang Sang's state of mind was greatly disturbed, and it was difficult for her to maintain her own world. There was gossamer floating in the air outside the window, and Ning Ke knew that it was a crack. If the world was smaller, or the matter in the world was less, with Sang Sang's ability, she might be able to maintain it for a longer period of time. Ning Ke looked at the looming crack in the space outside the window, and understood why he felt that separation was close at hand when he woke up in the morning. After a moment of silence, he led the big black horse out of the wooden hut. There was no clear cracking sound, but only a gust of cold wind. He returned to the real world, and stood by the real cold pond. Looking back, there was no road or house. He decided to leave here, as far as possible from the cold pond, and as far as possible from her. He understood what Long Qing had said before the battle. It turned out that his search was not a good thing for her. However, just as he was about to leave, someone came. That person returned to the pond. "Where is she?" The Abbey Dean looked at him and asked calmly. He was neither anxious nor angry, as if everything was under his control, like the water grass in the water, the shadow of the pond in the middle of the pond, and the will of heaven in his chest. Ning Ke did not answer his question. He took out his iron cutlass and chopped across the cold pond. He chopped thousands of times. The blade broke through the air and turned into countless shadows. Each shadow was a stroke, and 2 strokes were a character. His iron cutlass instantly wrote thousands of characters by the cold pond. Thousands of characters. His face was as pale as paper, and the psyche power in his sense of perception was emptied. Countless fierce talisman intents covered the cold pond. Under the Abbey Dean's feet, a few green grass that was stretching its wastes were silently broken into countless pieces. The cold tree by the pond was silently broken into countless pieces. The world by the cold pond was a painting. Ning Ke cut the painting into countless pieces. The Abbey Dean was a man in the painting. How could he be at ease? This chapter is mainly about, heaven is watching. A guy on Weibo said, when asking his girlfriend to make love, he always thinks of a saying, heaven is watching. W.B. Zach. When I saw it, I thought of Ning Ke and Sang Sang doing it. What was that? In the past, I've written about the battle between heaven and man, and the unification of heaven and man. But I've always wanted her to see it. The heavens are watching what man is doing. How cool. It was supposed to be a long and detailed description, but everyone knew about the recent situation, so I simplified it and kept the meaning. I couldn't help but feel a bit regretful. Many years ago, I wrote the part about Fan Xian and Zhang Daodu in the Qing dynasty with great care. I wanted to use other methods to write it again. What a pity. The last chapters must be written with great care. See you tomorrow. Chapter 1130. Something cropped up and he had to go out. Updates could only appear very late at night, so he had to report to everyone in advance. Chapter 1131. If the grass and flowers in the mountain formed a complete painting, then the Abbey Dean was indeed in the painting. However, he was also outside the painting. To be more precise, there seemed to be a small painting in the painting, and he was in the small painting. The small painting was the interlayer of the aura of heaven and earth, a secondary space between the real space. He was standing there. He seemed to be very close, but he was actually very far away. He seemed to be inside the painting, but he was actually inside the painting. Within a few feet of the Abbey Dean, under the influence of the aura of heaven and earth gushing out from the interlayer, the feeling of spring was extremely strong. There were green buds on the trees and yellow flowers in the grass. Ning Kei's thousands of iron cutlass strikes could cut the green buds and yellow flowers into pieces, but not the feeling of spring. The feeling of spring was invisible. The spring breeze blew and the leaves swayed. The Abbey Dean's figure instantly moved to a distance of more than 100 feet behind the cold lake. He was far away from the terrifying talisman intent and blade intent, and could not enter for the time being. It was like a city wall. People outside could not enter, and people inside could not leave even if they wanted to. Both the city and the cold lake eventually became a prison cell. Ning Kei had been imprisoned in Chang'an twice, so he was no stranger to this situation. You shouldn't have left Chang'an. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said. His expression was still calm and gentle, just like the spring breeze. He was like a teacher who knew everything in the world and was sincerely giving advice. You have no chance of winning. Ning Kei knew that the Abbey Dean was right. His most powerful weapon, or his biggest hope to defeat grand cultivators like the Abbey Dean and the drunkard, was the god-stunning array passed down to him by his teacher, Chang'an. Leaving Chang'an meant leaving this weapon thousands of miles away. In a sense, it was no different from suicide. But he had to leave Chang'an. He had made this decision on that snowy day, and he would never regret it. Because he knew that the Abbey Dean would kill Sang Sang, and he was the only one who could find Sang Sang before the Abbey Dean did. Instead of thinking about the past, he only thought about what would happen in the future. He looked at the fierce talisman intent that covered the sky and earth around the cold lake, and thought about what he should do later. The moment the blade intent dissipated, he would leave as far as possible. The Abbey Dean could not see through her world, so she would be safe. Everything was to give Sang Sang a chance to escape, but it would probably ruin all his chances. He looked at the big black horse, thinking that it would die with him, and felt a little guilty. The big black horse did not look at him. He did not want to see his apologetic eyes. He did not play cute, silly, or naive. He just stared at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the cold pond. His eyes were extremely sharp, like a warrior before a battle. Ning Kei was touched. He stroked the mane on its neck and smiled. Suddenly, his smile disappeared and his expression changed. He heard a crisp sound coming from behind him. A brand new wooden house appeared beside the cold pond. Sang Sang slowly walked out of the house with her hands on her waist. She had returned to the human world, she had dispersed her own world. Why did you come out? Ning Kei asked angrily. I don't feel well. Sang Sang strolled by the pond with her big belly. She didn't even look at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the pond and said expressionlessly, It's your fault. Where do you feel uncomfortable? What does it have to do with me again? It's all your fault. Of course it's your problem. Ning Kei was speechless. Wasn't it what she wanted? Of course, there was nothing to argue about at this moment. As for the reason why she came out, how could he not know? He was not going to ask further because the answer was a little mushy. Sang Sang said, I don't want you to leave. I want to be with you. I'm used to being with you. Being used to it was really a beautiful thing. Holding her hand, Ning Kei sat down on an old tree stump by the pool. Looking at her tired eyes, which shone with a certain luster of life, he felt unprecedentedly satisfied. Hearing her words, the outcome of the match and many other things were no longer that important. After Sang Sang came to the pond, the Abbey Dean was silent for a long time. Then he bowed to her from a distance. He was still polite and even a little pious, as if he was still her follower. Ning Ke sat under the tree stump and meditated, hoping to recover the psyche power that had been consumed by thousands of talismans as soon as possible. Looking at the Abbey Dean's behavior, he frowned slightly and was even more confused. Why? Why did the Abbey Dean want to kill Sang Sang? Helping Yi Su become a sage, starting a prairie fire of the new stream, splitting Taoism, destroying the foundation of Haotian's faith, weakening her and paying such a painful price just to kill her? Where was the reason? Where was the justice? This was the question of the Academy and the whole world. Taoism and the Academy are the same. It's not because the headmaster of the Academy used to study in Taoism, but because we both think from the perspective of human beings. The Abbey Dean stood by the pond and there was a green leaf between his fingers. It looked like a tiny flute. Even though we are the same, our final destination is different. The headmaster of the Academy wants to break the sky, but I don't. Ning Ke did not express his opinion on this question because he had tried it before and knew that it was almost impossible to change one's outlook on life. What do you want to do? This was his biggest concern. Chapter 1132. You see, reason is always the simplest thing in the world. Water flows downwards, clouds rise to the sky. Where there is light, there is darkness. When it's time to change, it's time to change. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke and explained calmly. Ning Ke was silent for a while and said, "Why didn't you think so before? After all, Haotian Taoism is Haotian Taoism. Just like the soul is human soul, who would want to kill themselves to exchange for a new soul when they are living a peaceful life?" The Abbey Dean rubbed the green leaf gently with his fingers. A fresh and sweet voice accompanied his words. It was as fragrant as the wildflowers around them. "I can think it through, or dare to think about it, thanks to Yi Su, my great disciple. He found a new way in the shabby alley of Linкong City and founded the new stream. He wrote those thought-provoking words and taught me to think in this way. In a sense, he is my teacher." The Abbey Dean's eyes fell on Sang Sang and he said the following important words. The doctrines of the new stream and Haotian Taoism do not actually conflict with each other. They are just truths from different times. For countless years, human beings have been in a desolate period and needed your protection. However, human beings are still growing. 1,000 years ago, there was the headmaster of Academy, the great divine priest of light who founded the Enlightenment doctrine, Kuharan, Lotus, and me. All these things prove that human beings have grown to a level that we could never imagine at the beginning. Human beings have grown up and no longer need your protection. They are strong enough to protect themselves. They don't need to die and come back to life like weeds. They don't need to endure the pain of endless reincarnation between the everlasting night and the daytime. The cold pond was still cold, but the lakeside was as warm as spring. Flowers were blooming and green trees were swaying. The scene that was cut into pieces by Ning Ke's blade was gradually restored by spring. It was silent for a long time. Only the pleasant sound of the leaf flute between the Abbey Dean's fingers could be heard. It was not the signal of retreat on the battlefield, but more like the beating of war drums. Ning Ke took a long time to digest the shock in his heart. He looked at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the river and said, "The headmaster said something similar. Human beings have indeed grown to the point where they don't need Haotian anymore. They have long stood up, and some can even fly freely. The difference is that the Academy thinks that human beings need to go to a wider world, while Haotian Taoism still thinks that they should stay where they are." The Abbey Dean said, "As I said many years ago, this is a difference of ideas that cannot be solved. I think eternity comes from the beauty of calmness and solemnity, but the headmaster and his disciples always think that change is eternity. Ning Ke said, changes are the norm. Unchanging is an anomaly that happens occasionally. The Abbé Dean said, mankind is a product of abnormality. Why should we pursue normality? Ning Ke said, if Yi Su were still alive, or eldest brother were here, they could debate with you. But I can't. I'm best at fighting and killing, not theory. But even I can see the biggest problem in your theory. The Abbé Dean said, please say it. Ning Ke said, if it is still a self-enclosed system that wants to be isolated from the outside world, then even without Haotian, we still need a collective will to carry out the rules. Who will do it? After a moment of silence, the Abbé Dean's voice sounded calmly. I will do it. The Abbé Dean said, you see, this matter can still be solved very easily. I will do it. What for? Be Haotian. Look, there is a grey machine in the sky. The weather is changing, it's thundering, it's raining, put away the clothes. In an instant, these words flashed through Ning Ke's mind. He lowered his head in silence and looked at the sky reflected by the gradually melting pond water. He gradually calmed down and began to think about this matter. The more he thought about it, the more he felt it was amazing. The Abbé Dean was really amazing. Kill Haotian and become the new Haotian. This was not what a man should do, but someone else could replace him. This was an unimaginable ambition, and also the most valiant spiritual declaration. Anything, as long as it was large enough, would give people a sense of greatness, such as the snow-capped peak or the wilderness. As long as the ambition was big enough, it was also a kind of greatness. In the end, the Abbé Dean still followed the headmaster and the youngest uncle. But he never doubted his own past, because Taoism's countless years of accumulation and foundation gave him enough ideas to directly draw a conclusion. If Haotian couldn't do it, then he would change it. He would do it himself. What a great ambition! What a great courage! Sang Sang looked at the other side of the river expressionlessly. Other than Ning Ke, the Abbé Dean was the person closest to Haotian in the whole world. Neither Wei Guangming nor the old revelation of heaven could be compared to him. He had comprehended the revelation of heaven and had waited for many years in the South Sea. He had communicated with her many times, so he naturally knew what she was trying to say. You are a statue erected by Taoism. It's just changing a statue. Why do you need to be brave for a while? The Abbé Dean looked at her and said. He was no longer as compassionate as before, but calm and natural as an elder. Then he looked at Ning Ke and said, neither the Academy nor Taoism wants Haotian. At least before the last part of the journey, we can walk the same path. Or can you really convince yourself that the headmaster is wrong? Ning Ke was silent for a long time and then said, no, the headmaster is not wrong. In an instant, the atmosphere of spring was so dense that it was hard to breathe. Ning Ke felt like he was bathing in the spring breeze, but he also felt like he was drowning. Sang Sang still held her hands behind her back and looked indifferent. But her eyes were slightly narrowed. The infinite sea of flowers was boundless spring. Every flower and every wisp of spring was the most powerful killing intent. Ning Ke raised the iron bow and pointed the cold and dark arrowhead at the Abbé Dean on the other side. The Abbé Dean looked at him calmly and held his hands behind his back just like Sang Sang. He was not vigilant at all, because he was just at the threshold and could turn around and leave at any time. No matter how powerful the primordial 13 arrows were, they could not hit him. Those doors were the gaps in the interlayer of the chi of heaven and earth. They were the blooming flowers in the mountains. Every flower was a gap and a door. It was impossible to determine which door the Abbé Dean would enter from. Ning Ke looked at the other side and felt the bowstring trembling slightly at the corner of his mouth. Beads of sweat dripped down, but he did not feel it. Sang Sang's hand fell on his shoulder. A warm or even hot power entered his body and instantly replenished the psyche power that he had used to write talismans. He was at his peak state. 19890-309. Sang Sang looked indifferent. She said 2 numbers, just like how she pointed the way in the wind and snow a few days ago, by the lake in winter a few years ago, and even earlier in Min Mountain. But her voice was no longer as childish as it was when she was young. And this time, the 2 numbers she said were longer and more complicated. Naturally, it meant that she was more precise. Ning Ke did not hesitate. To be more precise, he did not even think. Just like before, he pointed at a place on the other side of the lake and released the bowstring, as if it was an instinct. The iron arrow pierced through the air and flew away silently. Strangely enough, he was aiming at a falling tree, far away from the Abbey Dean's position. But the Abbey Dean's expression became extremely solemn. The Abbey Dean's figure disappeared between heaven and earth. He completely disappeared. This was the distanceless state. He entered the interlayer of the chi of heaven and earth. It was also quiet because he did not leave any trace, not even the wind. It was not until then that the buzzing sound of the iron arrow spread around the lake. A clear arrow path appeared in the sky above the cold pond. The condensed clouds slowly flowed. The iron arrow went somewhere. The big tree was still falling slowly, unaffected. There was no trace on the cliff further away, just like the Abbey Dean. The arrow seemed to have shot into nothingness. The next moment, on a snow-capped peak more than 10 miles away, the Abbey Dean's figure appeared, floating in the air in front of the cliff.